Chapter 16 of Best Russian Short Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Algy. Best Russian Short Stories. Edited and compiled by Thomas Seltzer. Dethroned by I.N. Potapenko. Well? Captain Zarubkin's wife called out impatiently to her husband, rising from the sofa and turning to face him as he entered. "He doesn't know anything about it," he replied indifferently, as if the matter were of no interest to him. Then he asked in a businesslike tone, "Nothing for me from the office?" "How should I know? Am I your errand boy?" "How they dilly-dally! If only the package doesn't come too late. It's so important." "Idiot?" "Who's an idiot?" "You, with your indifference, your stupid egoism." The captain said nothing. He was neither surprised nor insulted. On the contrary, the smile on his face was as though he had received a compliment. These wifely animadversions, probably oft heard, by no means interfered with his domestic peace. "It can't be that the man doesn't know when his wife is coming back home," Mrs. Zarubkin continued excitedly. "She's written to him every day of the 4 months that he's been away. The postmaster told me so." "Semyonov! Oh, Semyonov! Has anyone from the office been here?" "I don't know, your Excellency," came in a loud, clear voice from back of the room. "Why don't you know? Where have you been?" "I went to Abramka, your Excellency." "The tailor again?" "Yes, your Excellency, the tailor Abramka." The captain spat in annoyance. "And where is Krinka?" "He went to market, your Excellency." "Was he told to go to market?" "Yes, your Excellency." The captain spat again. "Why do you keep spitting? Such vulgar manners," his wife cried angrily. "You behave at home like a drunken subaltern. You haven't the least consideration for your wife. You are so coarse in your behaviour towards me. Do, please, go to your office." "Semyonov." "Your Excellency?" "If the package comes, please have it sent back to the office and say I've gone there. And listen, someone must always be here. I won't have everybody out of the house at the same time. Do you hear?" "Yes, your Excellency." The captain put on his cap to go. In the doorway he turned and addressed his wife. "Please, Tasha, don't send all the servants out on your errands at the same time. Something important may turn up, and then there's nobody here to attend to it." He went out, and his wife remained reclining on the sofa corner as if his plea were no concern of hers. But scarcely had he left the house when she called out, "Semyonov, come here, quick!" A barefooted, unshaven man in dark blue pantaloons and cotton shirt presented himself. His stocky figure and red face made a wholesome appearance. He was the captain's orderly. "At your service, your Excellency." "Listen, Semyonov, you don't seem to be stupid." "I don't know, your Excellency." "For goodness' sake, drop 'your Excellency.' I am not your superior officer." "Yes, your Idiot!" But the lady's manner towards the servant was far friendlier than toward her husband. Semyonov had it in his power to perform important services for her, while the captain had not come up to her expectations. "Listen, Semyonov, how do you and the doctor's men get along together? Are you friendly?" "Yes, your Excellency." "Intolerable!" cried the lady, jumping up. "Stop using that silly title. Can't you speak like a sensible man?" Semyonov had been standing in the stiff attitude of attention, with the palms of his hands at the seams of his trousers. Now he suddenly relaxed, and even wiped his nose with his fist. "That's the way we are taught to do," he said carelessly, with a clownish grin. "The gentlemen, the officers insist on it." "Now, tell me, you are on good terms with the doctor's men?" "You mean Podmar and Shukok? Of course, we're friends." "Very well. Then go straight to them and try to find out when Mrs. Shaldin is expected back. They ought to know. They must be getting things ready against her return, cleaning her bedroom and fixing it up. Do you understand? but be careful to find out right. And also be very careful not to let on for whom you are finding it out. Do you understand?" "Of course I understand." "Well, then go. But one more thing. Since you are going out, you may as well stop at Abramka again and tell him to come here right away. You understand?" "But His Excellency gave me orders to stay at home," said Semyonov, scratching himself behind his ears. "Please don't answer back. Just do as I tell you. Go on, now." "At your service." And the orderly, impressed by the lady's severe military tone, left the room. Mrs. Zarubkin remained reclining on the sofa for a while. Then she rose and walked up and down the room, and finally went to her bedroom, where her two little daughters were playing in their nurse's care. She scolded them a bit, and returned to her former place on the couch. Her every movement betrayed great excitement. Tatyana Grigoryevna Zarubkin was one of the most looked up to ladies of the S Regiment, and even of the whole town of Chmyrsk, where the regiment was quartered. To be sure, you hardly could say that, outside the regiment, the town could boast any ladies at all. There were very respectable women, decent wives, mothers, daughters, and widows of honourable citizens, but they all dressed in cotton and flannel, and on high holidays made a show of cheap cashmere gowns, over which they wore gay shawls with borders of wonderful arabesques. Their hats and other headgear gave not the faintest evidence of good taste. So they could scarcely be dubbed ladies. They were satisfied to be called women. One of them, almost, had the name of her husband's trade or position tacked to her name: Mrs. Grocer so-and-so, Mrs. Mayor so-and-so, Mrs. Milliner so-and-so, etc. Genuine ladies, in the Russian society sense, had never come to the town before the S Regiment had taken up its quarters there. And it goes without saying that the ladies of the regiment had nothing in common, and therefore no intercourse with, the women of the town. They were so dissimilar that they were like creatures of a different species. There is no disputing that Tatyana Grigoryevna Zarubkin was one of the most looked up to of the ladies. She invariably played the most important part at all the regimental affairs: the amateur theatricals, the social evenings, the afternoon teas. If the captain's wife was not to be present, it was a foregone conclusion that the affair would not be a success. The most important point was that Mrs. Zarubkin had the untarnished reputation of being the best dressed of all the ladies. She was always the most distinguished looking at the annual ball. Her gown for the occasion, ordered from Moscow, was always chosen with the greatest regard for her charms and defects, and it was always exquisitely beautiful. A new fashion could not gain admittance to the other ladies of the regiment except by way of the captain's wife. Thanks to her good taste in dressing, the stately blonde was queen at all the balls and in all the salons of Chmyrsk. Another advantage of hers was that although she was nearly 40, she still looked fresh and youthful, so that the young officers were constantly hovering about her and paying her homage. November was a very lively month in the regiment's calendar. It was on the 10th of November that the annual ball took place. The ladies, of course, spent their best efforts in preparation for this event. Needless to say that in all these arduous activities, Abramka Stiftik, the ladies' tailor, played a prominent rôle. He was the one man in Chmyrsk who had any understanding at all for the subtle art of the feminine toilet. Preparations had begun in his shop in August already. Within the last weeks, his modest parlour, furnished with 6 shabby chairs placed about a round table and a fly-specked mirror on the wall, the atmosphere heavy with the smell of onions and herring, had been filled from early morning to the evening hours with the most charming and elegant of the fairer sex. There was trying on and discussion of styles and selection of material. It was all very nerve-racking for the ladies. The only one who had never appeared in this parlour was the captain's wife. That had been a thorn in Abramka's flesh. He had spent days and nights going over in his mind how he could rid this lady of the, in his opinion, wretched habit of ordering her clothes from Moscow. For this ball, however, as she herself had told him, she had not ordered a dress, but only material from out of town, from which he deduced that he was to make the gown for her. But there was only 1 week left before the ball, and still she had not come to him. Abramka was in a state of feverishness. He longed once to make a dress for Mrs. Zarubkin. It would add to his glory. He wanted to prove that he understood his trade just as well as any tailor in Moscow, and that it was quite superfluous for her to order her gowns outside of Chmyrsk. He would come out the triumphant competitor of Moscow. As each day passed, and Mrs. Zarubkin did not appear in his shop, his nervousness increased. Finally she ordered a dressing jacket from him, but not a word said of a ball gown. What was he to think of it? So, when Semyonov told him that Mrs. Zarubkin was expecting him at her home, it goes without saying that he instantly removed the dozen pins in his mouth as he was trying on a customer's dress, told one of his assistants to continue with the fitting, and instantly set off to call on the captain's wife. In this case, it was not a question of a mere ball gown, but the acquisition of the best customer in town. Although Abramka wore a silk hat and a suit in keeping with the silk hat, still he was careful not to ring at the front entrance, but always knocked at the back door. At another time, when the captain's orderly was not in the house, for the captain's orderly also performed the duties of the captain's cook, he might have knocked long and loud. On other occasions a cannon might have been shot off right next to Tatyana Grigorievna's ears, and she would not have lifted her fingers to open the door. But now she instantly caught the sound of the modest knocking and opened the back door herself for Abramka. "Oh!" she cried delightedly. "You, Abramka!" She really wanted to address him less familiarly, as was more befitting so dignified a man in a silk hat. But everyone called him Abramka, and he would have been very much surprised had he been honoured with his full name, Abram Srulevich Stiftik. So she thought it best to address him as the others did. Mr. Abramka was tall and thin. There was always a melancholy expression in his pale face. He had a little stoop, a long and very heavy greyish beard. He had been practising his profession for 30 years. Ever since his apprenticeship he had been called Abramka, which did not strike him as at all derogatory or unfitting. Even his shingle read, "Ladies' Tailor Abramka Stiftik," the most valid proof that he had deemed his name immaterial, but that the chief thing to him was his art. As a matter of fact, he had attained, if not perfection in tailoring, yet remarkable skill. To this all the ladies of the S Regiment could attest with conviction. Abramka removed his silk hat, stepped into the kitchen, and said gravely, with profound feeling, "Mrs. Zarubkin, I am entirely at your service." "Come into the reception room. I have something very important to speak to you about." Abramka followed in silence. He stepped softly on tiptoe, as if afraid of waking someone. "Sit down, Abramka. Listen. But give me your word of honour you won't tell anyone?" Tatyana Grigorievna began, reddening a bit. She was ashamed to have let the tailor Abramka into her secret, but since there was no getting round it, she quieted herself and in an instant had regained her ease. "I don't know what you are speaking of, Mrs. Zarubkin," Abramka rejoined. He assumed a somewhat injured manner. "Have you ever heard of Abramka ever babbling anything out? You certainly know that in my profession, you know everybody has some secret to be kept." "Oh, you must have misunderstood me, Abramka. What sort of secrets do you mean?" "Well, one lady is a little bit one-sided, another lady," he pointed to his breast, "is not quite full enough, another lady has scrawny arms. Such things as that have to be covered up or filled out or laced in, so as to look better. That is where our art comes in. But we are in duty bound not to say anything about it." Tatyana Grigorievna smiled. Well, I can assure you I am all right that way. There is nothing about me that needs to be covered up or filled out." "Oh, as if I didn't know that. Everybody knows that Mrs. Zarubkin's figure is perfect," Abramka cried, trying to flatter his new customer. Mrs. Zarubkin laughed and made up her mind to remember. "Everybody knows that Mrs. Zarubkin's figure is perfect." Then she said, "You know that the ball is to take place in a week." "Yes, indeed, Mrs. Zarubkin, in only 1 week. Unfortunately, only 1 week," replied Abramka, sighing. "But you remember your promise to make my dress for me for the ball this time." "Mrs. Zarubkin," Abramka cried, laying his hand on his heart, "have I said that I was not willing to make it? No, indeed. I said it must be made, and made right. For Mrs. Zarubkin it must be better than for any one else. That's the way I feel about it." "Splendid! Just what I wanted to know." "But why don't you show me your material? Why don't you say to me, 'Here, Abramka, here is the stuff, make a dress'? Abramka would work on it day and night." "That's just it. I can't order it. That's where the trouble comes in. Tell me, Abramka, what is the shortest time you need for making the dress? Listen, the very shortest." Abramka shrugged his shoulders. "Well, is a week too much for a ball dress such as yours will want? It's got to be sewed, it can't be pasted together. You yourself know that, Mrs. Zarubkin." "But supposing I order it only 3 days before the ball?" Abramka started. "Only 3 days before the ball? A ball dress? Am I a god, Mrs. Zarubkin? I am nothing but the ladies' tailor, Abramka Stiftik." "Well, then, you are a nice tailor," said Tatyana Grigoryevna scornfully. "In Moscow they made a ball dress for me in 2 days." Abramka jumped up as if at a shot and beat his breast. "Is that so? Then I say, Mrs. Zarubkin," he cried pathetically, "if they made a ball gown for you in Moscow in 2 days, very well, then I will make a ball gown for you, if I must, in 1 day. I will neither eat nor sleep, and I won't let my help off either for 1 minute. How does that suit you?" "Sit down, Abramka. Thank you very much. I hope I shall not have to put such a strain on you. It really does not depend upon me. Otherwise I should have ordered the dress from you long ago." "It doesn't depend on you? Then upon whom does it depend?" "It depends upon—" "But now, Abramka, remember this is just between you and me. It depends upon Mrs. Shaldin." "Upon Mrs. Shaldin, the doctor's wife? Why, she isn't even here." "That's just it. That's why I have to wait. How is it that a clever man like you, Abramka, doesn't grasp the situation?" Let me see." Abramka racked his brains for a solution of the riddle. How could it be that Mrs. Shaldin, who was away, should have anything to do with Mrs. Zarubkin's order for a gown? No, that passed his comprehension. "She certainly will get back in time for the ball," said Mrs. Zarubkin, to give him a cue. "Well, yes." "And certainly will bring a dress back with her." "Certainly." "A dress from abroad, something we have never seen here, something highly original." "Mrs. Zarubkin," Abramka cried, as if a truth of tremendous import had been revealed to him. "Mrs. Zarubkin, I understand. Why, certainly. Yes, but that will be pretty hard." "That's just it." Abramka reflected a moment, then said, "I assure you, Mrs. Zarubkin, you need not be a bit uneasy. I will make a dress for you that will be just as grand as the one from abroad. I assure you, your dress will be the most elegant one at the ball, just as it always has been. I tell you, my name won't be Abramka Stiftik if—" His eager asseverations seemed not quite to satisfy the captain's wife. Her mind was not quite set at ease. She interrupted him. "But the style, Abramka, the style! You can't possibly guess what the latest fashion is abroad." "Why shouldn't I know what the latest fashion is, Mrs. Zarubkin? In Kiev I have a friend who publishes fashion plates. I will telegraph to him, and he will immediately send me pictures of the latest French models. The telegram will cost only 80 cents, Mrs. Zarubkin, and I swear to you I will copy any dress he sends. Mrs. Sheldon can't possibly have a dress like that." "All very well and good, and that's what we'll do. Still we must wait until Mrs. Sheldon comes back. Don't you see, Abramka, I must have exactly the same style that she has. Can't you see that nobody can say that she is in the latest fashion?" At this point Semyonov entered the room cautiously. He was wearing the oddest looking jacket and the captain's old boots. His hair was rumpled, and his eyes were shining suspiciously. There was every sign that he had used the renewal of friendship with the doctor's men as a pretext for a booze. "I had to stand them some brandy, your Excellency," he said saucily, but catching his mistress's threatening look, he lowered his head guiltily. "Idiot!" she yelled at him. "Face about! Be off with you to the kitchen!" In his befuddlement Semyonov had not noticed Abramka's presence. Now he became aware of him, faced about, and retired to the kitchen sheepishly. "What an impolite fellow!" said Abramka reproachfully. "Oh, you wouldn't believe," said the captain's wife, but instantly followed Semyonov into the kitchen. Semyonov, aware of his awful misdemeanour, tried to stand up straight and give a report. "She will come back, your Excellency, day after tomorrow toward evening. She sent a telegram." "Is that true now?" "I swear it's true. Shuchok saw it himself." "All right, very good. You'll get something for this?" "Yes, your Excellency." "Silence, you goose. Go on, set the table." Abramka remained about 10 minutes longer with the captain's wife, and on leaving said, "Let me assure you once again, Mrs. Zarubkin, you needn't worry. Just select the style, and I will make a gown for you that the best tailor in Paris can't beat." He pressed his hand to his heart in token of his intention to do everything in his power for Mrs. Zarubkin. It was 7 o'clock in the evening. Mrs. Sheldon and her trunk had arrived hardly half an hour before, yet the captain's wife was already there paying visit, which was a sign of the warm friendship that existed between the two women. They kissed each other and fell to talking. The doctor, a tall man of 45, seemed discomfited by the visit, and cast unfriendly side glances at his guest. He had hoped to spend that evening undisturbed with his wife, and he well knew that when the ladies of the regiment came to call upon each other for only a second, it meant a whole evening of listening to idle talk. "You won't believe me, dear, how bored I was the whole time you were away. How I longed for you, Natalia Semyonovna. But you probably never gave us a thought." "Oh, how can you say anything like that? I was thinking of you every minute, every second. If I hadn't been obliged to finish the cure, I should have returned long ago. No matter how beautiful it may be away from home, still the only place to live is among those that are near and dear to you." These were only the preliminary soundings. They lasted with variations for a quarter of an hour. First Mrs. Sheldon narrated a few incidents of the trip. Then Mrs. Zarubkin gave a report of some of the chief happenings in the life of the regiment. When the conversation was in full swing, and the samovar was singing on the table, and the pancakes were spreading their appetizing odour, the captain's wife suddenly cried, "I wonder what the fashions are abroad now. I say, you must have feasted your eyes on them." Mrs. Sheldon simply replied with a scornful gesture, "Oh, other people may like them, but I don't care for them one bit. I'm glad we here don't get to see them until a year later. You know, Tatyana Grigoryevna, you sometimes see the ugliest styles." "Really?" asked the captain's wife eagerly, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. The great moment of complete revelation seemed to have arrived. "Perfectly hideous, I tell you. Just imagine. You know how nice the plain skirts were? Then why change them? But no, to be in the style now, the skirts have to be draped. Why? It's just a sign of the complete lack of imagination. And in Lyons they got out a new kind of silk. But that is still a French secret." "Why? A secret? The silk is certainly being worn already?" "Yes, but one does see it being worn already. But when it was first manufactured, the greatest secret was made of it. They were afraid the Germans would imitate. You understand?" "Oh, but what is the latest style?" "I really can't explain it to you. All I know is, it is something awful." "She can't explain? That means she doesn't want to explain. Oh, the cunning one! What a sly look she has in her eyes." So thought the captain's wife. From the very beginning of the conversation, the two warm friends, it need scarcely be said, were mutually distrustful. Each had the conviction that everything the other said was to be taken in the very opposite sense. They were of about the same age, Mrs. Shaldin possibly 1 or 2 years younger than Mrs. Zarubkin. Mrs. Zarubkin was rather plump and had heavy light hair. Her appearance was blooming. Mrs. Shaldin was slim, though well proportioned. She was a brunette with a pale complexion and large dark eyes. There were two types of beauty very likely to divide the gentlemen of the regiment into two camps of admirers. But women are never content with halves. Mrs. Zarubkin wanted to see all the officers of the regiment at her feet, and so did Mrs. Shaldin. It naturally led to great rivalry between the two women, of which they were both conscious, though they always had the friendliest smiles for each other. Mrs. Shaldin tried to give a different turn to the conversation. "Do you think the ball will be interesting this year?" "Why should it be interesting?" rejoined the captain's wife scornfully. "Always the same people, the same old humdrum jog-trot?" "I suppose the ladies have been besieging your poor Abramka?" "I really can't tell you. As far as I am concerned, I have scarcely looked at what he made for me." How's that? Didn't you order your dress from Moscow again?" "No, it really does not pay. I am sick of the bother of it all. Why all that trouble? For whom? Our officers don't care a bit how one dresses. They haven't the least taste." There's something back of that," thought Mrs. Shaldin. The captain's wife continued with apparent indifference. "I can guess what a gorgeous dress you had made abroad. Certainly in the latest fashion." "I?" Mrs. Shaldin laughed innocently. "How could I get the time during my cure to think of a dress? As a matter of fact, I completely forgot the ball, thought of it at the last moment, and bought the first piece of goods I laid my hands on." "Pink?" "Oh no. How can you say pink?" "Light blue, then." "You can't call it exactly light blue. It's a very undefined sort of colour. I really wouldn't know what to call it." "But it certainly must have some sort of a shade." "You may believe me or not if you choose, but I really don't know. It's a very indefinite shade." "Is it Surah silk?" "No, I can't bear Surah. It doesn't keep the folds well." "I suppose it's crêpe de chine." "Heavens, no! Crêpe de chine is much too expensive for me." "Then what can it be?" "Oh, wait a minute. What is the name of that goods? You know, there are so many funny new names now. They don't make any sense." "Then show me your dress, dearest. Do please show me your dress." Mrs. Shaldin seemed to be highly embarrassed. "I am so sorry I can't. It is way down at the bottom of the trunk. There is the trunk, you see yourself. I couldn't unpack it now." The trunk, close to the wall, was covered with oilcloth and tied tight with heavy cords. The captain's wife devoured it with her eyes. She would have liked to see through and through it. She had nothing to say in reply, for it certainly was impossible to ask her friend, tired out from her recent journey, to begin to unpack right away, and take out all her things to show her her new dress. Yet she could not tear her eyes away from the trunk. There was a magic in it that held her enthralled. Had she been alone, she would have begun to unpack it herself, nor even asked the help of the servant to undo the knots. Now there was nothing left for her but to turn her eyes sorrowfully away from the fascinating object, and to take up another topic of conversation to which she would be utterly indifferent. But she couldn't think of anything else to talk about. Mrs. Shaldin must have prepared herself beforehand. She must have suspected something. So now Mrs. Zarubkin pinned her last hope to Abramka's inventiveness. She glanced at the clock. "Dear me, she exclaimed, as if surprised at the lateness of the hour. "I must be going. I don't want to disturb you any longer either, dearest. You must be very tired. I hope you rest well." She shook hands with Mrs. Shaldin, kissed her, and left. Abramka Stiftik had just taken off his coat and was doing some ironing in his shirt sleeves when a peculiar figure appeared in his shop. It was that of a stocky orderly in a well-worn uniform without buttons and old galoshes instead of boots. His face was gloomy-looking and was covered with a heavy growth of hair. Abramka knew this figure well. It seemed always just to have awakened from the deepest sleep. "Ah, Shuchok, what do you want?" "Mrs. Shaldin would like you to call upon her," said Shuchok. He behaved as if he had come on a terribly serious mission. "Oh, that's so. Your lady has come back. I heard about it. You see, I'm very busy. Still, you may tell her I'm coming right away. I just want to finish ironing Mrs. Konopotkin's dress." Abramka simply wanted to keep up appearances, as always when he was sent for. But his joy at the summons to Mrs. Shaldin was so great that, to the astonishment of his helpers and Shuchok, he left immediately. He found Mrs. Shaldin alone. She had not slept well the 2 nights before, and had risen late that morning. Her husband had left long before for the military hospital. She was sitting beside her open trunk, taking her things out very carefully. "How do you do, Mrs. Shaldin? Welcome back to Chmyrsk. I congratulate you on your happy arrival." "Oh, how do you do, Abramka?" said Mrs. Shaldin delightedly. "We haven't seen each other for a long time, have we? I was rather homesick for you." "Oh, Mrs. Shaldin, you must have had a very good time abroad. But what do you need me for? You certainly brought a dress back with you." "Abramka always comes in handy," said Mrs. Shaldin jestingly. "We ladies of the regiment are quite helpless without Abramka. Take a seat." Abramka seated himself. He felt much more at ease in Mrs. Shaldin's home than in Mrs. Zarubkin's. Mrs. Shaldin did not order her clothes from Moscow. She was a steady customer of his. In this room he had many a time circled about the doctor's wife with a yard measure, pins, chalk and scissors, had kneeled down beside her, raised himself to his feet, bent over again and stood puzzling over some difficult problem of dressmaking. How low to cut the dress out at the neck, how long to make the train, how wide the hem, and so on. None of the ladies of the regiment ordered as much from him as Mrs. Shaldin. Her grandmother would send her material from Kiev, or the doctor would go on a professional trip to Chernigov, and would always bring some goods back with him. Or sometimes her aunt in Voronezh would make a gift of some silk. "Abramka is always ready to serve Mrs. Shaldin first," said the tailor, though seized with a little pang, as if bitten by a guilty conscience. "Are you sure you are telling the truth? Is Abramka always to be depended upon? Eh, is he?" She looked at him searchingly from beneath drooping lids. "What a question!" rejoined Abramka. His face quivered slightly. His feeling of discomfort was waxing. "Has Abramka ever—" "Oh, things can happen. But all right, never mind, I brought a dress along with me. I had to have it made in a great hurry, and there is just a little more to be done on it. Now, if I give you this dress to finish, can I be sure that you positively won't tell another soul how it is made?" "Mrs. Shaldin, oh, Mrs. Shaldin," said Abramka reproachfully. Nevertheless, the expression of his face was not so reassuring as usual. "You give me your word of honour?" "Certainly. My name isn't Abramka Stiftik if I—" "Well, all right, I will trust you. But be careful. You know of whom you must be careful?" "Who is that, Mrs. Shaldin?" "Oh, you know very well who I mean. No, you needn't put your hand on your heart. She was here to see me yesterday, and tried in every way she could to find out how my dress is made. But she couldn't get it out of me." Abramka sighed. Mrs. Shaldin seemed to suspect his betrayal. "I am right, am I not? She has not had her dress made yet, has she? She waited to see my dress, didn't she? And she told you to copy the style, didn't she?" Mrs. Shaldin asked with honest naivety. But I warn you, Abramka, if you give away the least little thing about my dress, then all is over between you and me. Remember that." Abramka's hand went to his heart again, and the gesture carried the same sense of conviction as of old. "Mrs. Shaldin, how can you speak like that?" "Wait a moment." Mrs. Shaldin left the room. About 10 minutes passed, during which Abramka had plenty of time to reflect. How could he have given the captain's wife a promise like that so lightly? What was the captain's wife to him as compared with the doctor's wife? Mrs. Zarubkin had never given him a really decent order. Just a few things for the house and some mending. Supposing he were now to perform this great service for her, would that mean he could depend upon her for the future? Was any woman to be depended upon? She would wear this dress out and go back to ordering her clothes from Moscow again. But Mrs. Shaldin, she was very different. He could forgive her having brought this one dress along from abroad. What woman in Russia would have refrained, when abroad, from buying a new dress? Mrs. Shaldin would continue to be a steady customer all the same. The door opened. Abramka rose involuntarily and clasped his hands in astonishment. "Well," he exclaimed rapturously, "that is a dress, that is... my! He was so stunned he could find nothing more to say. And how charming Mrs. Shaldin looked in her wonderful gown! Her tall slim figure seemed to have been made for it. What simple yet elegant lines! At first glance you would think it was nothing more than an ordinary house gown, but only at first glance. If you looked at it again, you could tell right away that it met all the requirements of a fancy ball gown. What struck Abramka most was that it had no waistline, that it did not consist of bodice and skirt. That was strange. It was just caught lightly together under the bosom, which it brought out in relief. Draped over the whole was a sort of upper garment of exquisite old rose lace embroidered with large silk flowers, which fell from the shoulders and broadened out in bold superb lines. The dress was cut low and edged with a narrow strip of black down round the bosom, round the bottom of the lace drapery, and around the hem of the skirt. A wonderful fan of feathers to match the down edging gave the finishing touch. "Well, how do you like it, Abramka?" asked Mrs. Shaldin with a triumphant smile. "Glorious, glorious! I haven't the words at my command. What a dress! No, I couldn't make a dress like that. And how beautifully it fits you, as if you had been born in it, Mrs. Shaldin. What do you call the style?" "Empire." "Empire?" he queried. "Is that a new style? Well, what people don't think of. Tailors like us might just as well throw our needles and scissors away." "Now listen, Abramka. I wouldn't have shown it to you if there were not this sewing to be done on it. You are the only one who will have seen it before the ball. I am not even letting my husband look at it." "Oh, Mrs. Shaldin, you can rely upon me as upon a rock. But after the ball, may I copy it?" "Oh yes, after the ball copy it as much as you please, but not now, not for anything in the world." There were no doubts in Abramka's mind when he left the doctor's house. He had arrived at his decision. That superb creation had conquered him. It would be a piece of audacity on his part, he felt, even to think of imitating such a gown. Why, it was not a gown. It was a dream, a fantastic vision, without a bodice, without puffs or frills or tawdry trimmings of any sort. Simplicity itself, and yet so chic. Back in his shop, he opened the package of fashion plates that had just arrived from Kiev. He turned the pages and stared in astonishment. What was that? Could he trust his eyes? An Empire gown. There it was, with the broad voluptuous drapery of lace hanging from the shoulders and the edging of down, almost exactly the same thing as Mrs. Shaldin's. He glanced up and saw Semyonov outside the window. He had certainly come to fetch him to the captain's wife, who must have ordered him to watch the tailor's movements, and must have learnt that he had just been at Mrs. Shaldin's. Semyonov entered and told him his mistress wanted to see him right away. Abramka slammed the fashion magazine shut, as if afraid Semyonov might catch a glimpse of the new Empire fashion and give the secret away. "I will come immediately," he said crossly. He picked up his fashion plates, put the yard measure in his pocket, rammed his silk hat sorrowfully on his head, and set off for the captain's house. He found Mrs. Zarubkin pacing the room excitedly, greeted her, but carefully avoided meeting her eyes. "Well, what did you find out?" "Nothing, Mrs. Zarubkin," said Abramka dejectedly. "Unfortunately, I couldn't find out a thing." "Idiot! I have no patience with you. Where are the fashion plates?" "Here, Mrs. Zarubkin." She turned the pages, looked at one picture after the other, and suddenly her eyes shone and her cheeks reddened. "Oh, Empire! The very thing! Empire is the very latest. Make this one for me," she cried commandingly. Abramka turned pale. "Empire, Mrs. Zarubkin? I can't make that Empire dress for you," he murmured. "Why not?" asked the captain's wife, giving him a searching look. Because I can't." "Oh, you can't. You know why you can't? Because that is the style of Mrs. Sheldon's dress. So that is the reliability you boast so about? Great." "Mrs. Zarubkin, I will make any other dress you choose, but it is absolutely impossible for me to make this one." "I don't need your fashion plates, do you hear me? Get out of here, and don't ever show your face again." "Mrs. Zarubkin, Get out of here," repeated the captain's wife, quite beside herself. The poor tailor stuck his yard measure, which he had already taken out, back into his pocket and left. Half an hour later the captain's wife was entering a train for Kiev, carrying a large package which contained material for a dress. The captain had accompanied her to the station with a pucker in his forehead. That was 5 days before the ball. At the ball, 2 expensive Empire gowns stood out conspicuously from among the more or less elegant gowns which had been finished in the shop of Abramka Stiftik, ladies' tailor. The one gown adorned Mrs. Sheldon's figure, the other the figure of the captain's wife. Mrs. Zarubkin had bought her gown ready-made at Kiev, and had returned only 2 hours before the beginning of the ball. She had scarcely had time to dress. Perhaps it would have been better had she not appeared at this one of the annual balls, had she not taken that fateful trip to Kiev. For in comparison with the make and style of Mrs. Sheldon's dress, which had been brought abroad, hers was like the botched imitation of an amateur. That was evident to everybody, though the captain's wife had her little circle of partisans, who maintained with exaggerated eagerness that she looked extraordinarily fascinating in her dress, and Mrs. Sheldon still could not rival her. But there was no mistaking it, there was little justice in this contention. Everybody knew better. What was worst of all, Mrs. Zarubkin herself knew better. Mrs. Sheldon's triumph was complete. The 2 ladies gave each other the same friendly smiles as always, but one of them was experiencing the fine disdain and the derision of the conqueror, while the other was burning inside with the furious resentment of a dethroned goddess of the annual ball. From that time on, Abramka cautiously avoided passing the captain's house. End of Dethroned by I.N. Potapenko. Recording by Algy Pug, Perth, Western Australia.
Chapter 17 of Best Russian Short Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Best Russian Short Stories, edited and compiled by Thomas Seltzer. The Servant by Sergei Semyonov. Gerasim returned to Moscow just at the time when it was hardest to find work, a short while before Christmas, when a man sticks even to a poor job in the expectation of a present. For 3 weeks the peasant lad had been going about in vain seeking a position. He stayed with relatives and friends from his village, and although he had not yet suffered great want, it disheartened him that he, a strong young man, should go without work. Gerasim had lived in Moscow from early boyhood. When still a mere child, he had gone to work in a brewery as a bottle washer, and later as a lower servant in a house. In the last 2 years he had been in a merchant's employ, and would still have held that position had he not been summoned back to his village for military duty. However, he had not been drafted. It seemed dull to him in the village. He was not used to the country life, so he decided he would rather count the stones in Moscow than stay there. Every minute it was getting to be more and more irksome for him to be tramping the streets in idleness. Not a stone did he leave unturned in his effort to secure any sort of work. He plagued all of his acquaintances. He even held up people on the street and asked them if they knew of a situation. All in vain. Finally, Gerasim could no longer bear being a burden on his people. Some of them were annoyed by his coming to them, and others had suffered unpleasantness from their masters on his account. He was altogether at a loss what to do. Sometimes he would go a whole day without eating. One day Gerasim betook himself to a friend from his village, who lived at the extreme outer edge of Moscow, near Sokolnik. The man was the coachman to a merchant by the name of Sharov, in whose service he had been for many years. He had ingratiated himself with his master so that Sharov trusted him absolutely and gave every sign of holding him in high favour. It was the man's glib tongue, chiefly, that had gained him his master's confidence. He told on all the servants, and Sharov valued him for it. Gerasim approached and greeted him. The coachman gave his guest a proper reception, served him with tea and something to eat, and asked him how he was doing. "Very badly, Yegor Danilych," said Gerasim. "I've been without a job for weeks."
"Didn't you ask your old employer to take you back?"
"I did."
"He wouldn't take you again."
The position was filled already.
"That's it, that's the way you young fellows are. You serve your employers so-so, and when you leave your jobs, you usually have muddied up the way back to them. You ought to serve your masters so that they will think a lot of you, and when you come again, they will not refuse you, but rather dismiss the man who has taken your place."
"How can a man do that? In these days there aren't any employers like that, and we aren't exactly angels, are there?"
"What's the use of wasting words? I just want to tell you about myself. If for some reason or other I should ever have to leave this place and go home, not only would Mr. Sharov, if I came back, take me on again without a word, but he would be glad to, too."
Gerasim sat there downcast. He saw his friend was boasting, and it occurred to him to gratify him. "I know it," he said, "but it's hard to find men like you, Yegor Danilych. If you were a poor worker, your master would not have kept you 12 years. Yegor smiled. He liked the praise.
"That's it," he said. "If you were to live and serve as I do, you wouldn't be out of work for months and months."
Gerasim made no reply. Yegor was summoned to his master.
"Wait a moment," he said to Gerasim. "I'll be right back."
"Very well." Yegor came back and reported that inside of half an hour he would have to have the horses harnessed and ready to drive his master to town. He lighted his pipe and took several turns in the room. Then he came to a halt in front of Gerasim.
"Listen, my boy," he said. "If you want, I'll ask my master to take you as a servant here."
"Does he need a man?"
"We have one, but he's not much good. He's getting old, and it's very hard for him to do the work. It's lucky for us that the neighborhood isn't a lively one, and the police don't make a fuss about things being kept just so, else the old man couldn't manage to keep the place clean enough for them."
"Oh, if you can, then please do say a word for me, Yegor Danilych. I'll pray for you all my life. I can't stand being without work any longer."
"All right, I'll speak for you. Come again tomorrow, and in the meantime take this 10-kopek piece. It may come in handy."
"Thanks, Yegor Danilych. Then you will try for me? Please, do me the favor."
"All right, I'll try for you."
Gerasim left, and Yegor harnessed his horses. Then he put out his coachman's habit and drove up to the front door. Mr. Sharov stepped out of the house, seated himself in the sleigh, and the horses galloped off. He attended to his business in town and returned home. Yegor, observing that his master was in a good humour, said to him,
"Yegor Fyodorich, I have a favour to ask of you."
"What is it?"
"There's a young man from my village here, a good boy. He's without a job."
"Well?"
"Wouldn't you take him?"
"What do I want him for?"
"Use him as a man of all work round the place."
"How about Polikarpych?"
"What good is he? It's about time you dismissed him."
"That wouldn't be fair. He has been with me so many years. I can't let him go just so, without any cause."
"Supposing he has worked for you for years. He didn't work for nothing. He got paid for it. He certainly saved up a few dollars for his old age." "Saved up? How could he? From what? He's not alone in the world. He has a life to support. and she has to eat and drink also. His wife earns money too, a day's work as a charwoman. A lot you could have made, enough for Kvass. Why should you care about Polycarpich and his wife? To tell you the truth, he's a very poor servant. Why should you throw your money away on him? He never shovels the snow away on time or does anything right, and when it comes his turn to be night watchman, he slips away at least 10 times a night. It's too cold for him. You'll see some day because of him you will have trouble with the police. The quarterly inspector will descend on us, and it won't be so agreeable for you to be responsible for Polycarpich. Still, it's pretty rough. He's been with me 15 years, and to treat him that way in his old age, it would be a sin. A sin? What harm would you be doing him? He won't starve. He'll go to the almshouse. It will be better for him, too, to be quiet in his old age. Sheriff reflected. "All right," he said finally. "Bring your friend here. I'll see what I can do." "Do take him, sir. I'm so sorry for him. He's a good boy, and he's been without work for such a long time. I know he'll do his work well and serve you faithfully. On account of having to report for military duty, he lost his last position. If it hadn't been for that, his master would never have let him go."
The next evening, Gerasim came again and asked, "Well, could you do anything for me?"
"Something, I believe. First, let's have some tea, then we'll go see my master."
Even tea had no allurement for Gerasim. He was eager for a decision, but under the compulsion of politeness to his host, he gulped down 2 glasses of tea, and then they betook themselves to Sharov. Sharov asked Gerasim where he had lived before, and what work he could do. Then he told him he was prepared to engage him as a man of all work, and he should come back the next day ready to take the place. Gerasim was fairly stunned by the great stroke of fortune. So overwhelming was his joy that his legs would scarcely carry him. He went to the coachman's room, and Yegor said to him, "Well, my lad, see to it that you do your work right, so that I shan't have to be ashamed of you. You know what masters are like. If you go wrong once, they'll be at you forever after, with their fault-finding, and never give you peace." "Don't worry about that, Yegor Danilych."
Well.
Gerasim took leave, crossing the yard to go out by the gate. Polycarpich's rooms gave on the yard, and the broad beam of light from the window fell across Gerasim's way. He was curious to get a glimpse of his future home, but the panes were all frosted over, and it was impossible to peep through. However, he could hear what the people inside were saying. "What will we do now?" was said in a woman's voice. I don't know, a man, undoubtedly Polycarpich, replied. "Go begging, I suppose." "That's all we can do, there's nothing else left," said the woman. "Oh, we poor people, what miserable life we lead! We work and work from early morning till late at night, day after day, and when we get out, then it's away with you." "What can we do? Our master is not one of us. It wouldn't be worth the while to say much to him about it. He cares only for his advantage." "Oh, the masters are so mean. They don't think of anyone but themselves. It doesn't occur to them that we work for them honestly and faithfully for years, and use up all our best strength in their service. They're afraid to keep us a year longer, even though we've got all the strength we need to do their work. If we weren't strong enough, we'd go off our own accord." "The master's not so much to blame as his coachman. Yegor Danilych wants to get a good position for his friend." "Yes, he's a serpent. He knows how to lag his tongue. You wait, you foul-mouthed beast. I'll get even with you. I'll go straight to the master and tell him how the fellow deceives him, how he steals the hand fodder. I'll put it down in writing, and he can convince himself how the fellow lies about us all." "Don't, old woman, don't sin." "Sin? Isn't what I said all true? I know to a dot what I'm saying, and I mean to tell it straight out to the master. He should see with his own eyes." "Why not? What can we do now anyhow? Where shall we go? He's ruined us, ruined us." The old woman burst out sobbing. Gerasim heard all that, and it stabbed him like a dagger. He realized what misfortune he would be bringing the old people, and it made him sick at heart. He stood there a long while, saddened, lost in thought.
Then he turned and went back into the coachman's room. "Ah, you forgot something." "No, Yegor Danilych," Gerasim stammered out. "I've come... listen. I wanted to thank you ever and ever so much for the way you received me, and all the trouble you took for me, but I can't take the place." "What? What does that mean?" "Nothing. I don't want the place. I will look for another one for myself." "Did you mean to make a fool of me, did you, you idiot? You come here so meek. Try for me, and then you refuse to take the place. You rascal, you have disgraced me." Gerasim found nothing to say in reply. He reddened and lowered his eyes. Yegor turned his back scornfully and said nothing more. Then Gerasim quietly picked up his cap and left the coachman's room. He crossed the yard rapidly, went out by the gate, and hurried off down the street. He felt happy and light-hearted. End of The Servant by Sergei Semyonov.
Chapter 18 of Best Russian Short Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Mark Penfold. Best Russian Short Stories. Edited and compiled by Thomas Seltzer. One Autumn Night by Maxim Gorky. Once in the autumn I happened to be in a very unpleasant and inconvenient position. In the town where I had just arrived, and where I knew not a soul, I found myself without a farthing in my pocket and without a night's lodging. Having sold during the first few days every part of my costume without which it was still possible to go about, I passed from the town into the quarter called Yiste, where were the steamship wharves, a quarter which during the navigation season fermented with boisterous, laborious life, but now was silent and deserted, for we were in the last days of October. Dragging my feet along the moist sand, and obstinately scrutinizing it with a desire to discover in it any sort of fragment of food, I wandered alone among the deserted buildings and warehouses, and thought how good it would be to get a full meal. In our present state of culture, hunger of the mind is more quickly satisfied than hunger of the body. You wander about the streets, you are surrounded by buildings not bad-looking from the outside, and, you may safely say it, not so badly furnished inside, and the sight of them may excite within you stimulating ideas about architecture, hygiene, and many other wise and high-flying subjects. You may meet warmly and neatly dressed folks, all very polite, and turning away from you tactfully, not wishing offensively to notice the lamentable fact of your existence. Well, well, the mind of a hungry man is always better nourished and healthier than the mind of the well-fed man, and there you have a situation from which you may draw a very ingenious conclusion in favor of the ill-fed. The evening was approaching, the rain was falling, and the wind blew violently from the north. It whistled in the empty booths and shops, blew into the plastered window-panes of the taverns, and whipped into foam the wavelets of the river, which splashed noisily on the sandy shore, casting high their white crests, racing one after another into the dim distance, and leaping impetuously over one another's shoulders. It seemed as if the river felt the proximity of winter, and was running at random away from the fetters of ice which the north wind might well have flung upon her that very night. The sky was heavy and dark, down from it swept incessantly scarcely visible drops of rain, and the melancholy elegy in nature all around me was emphasized by a couple of battered and misshapen willow trees, and a boat, bottom upwards, that was fastened to their roots. The overturned canoe with its battered keel and the miserable old trees rifled by the cold wind. Everything around me was bankrupt, barren, and dead, and the sky flowed with undryable tears. Everything around was waste and gloomy. It seemed as if everything were dead, leaving me alone among the living, and for me also a cold death waited. I was then 18 years old. A good time. I walked and walked along the cold wet sand, making my chattering teeth warble in honor of cold and hunger, when suddenly, as I was carefully searching for something to eat behind one of the empty crates, I perceived behind it, crouching on the ground, a figure in woman's clothes, dank with the rain and clinging fast to her stooping shoulders. Standing over her, I watched to see what she was doing. It appeared that she was digging a trench in the sand with her hands, digging away under one of the crates. "Why are you doing that?" I asked, crouching down on my heels quite close to her. She gave a little scream and was quickly on her legs again. Now that she stood there staring at me with her wide-open gray eyes full of terror, I perceived that it was a girl of my own age, with a very pleasant face embellished unfortunately by 3 large blue marks. This spoiled her, although these blue marks had been distributed with a remarkable sense of proportion, one at a time, and all were of equal size. 2 under the eyes, and 1 a little bigger on the forehead just over the bridge of the nose. This symmetry was evidently the work of an artist well inured to the business of spoiling the human physiognomy. The girl looked at me, and the terror in her eyes gradually died out. She shook the sand from her hands, adjusted her cotton headgear, cowered down, and said, "I suppose you too want something to eat? Dig away, then. My hands are tired. Over there." She nodded her head in the direction of a booth. "There is bread for certain, and sausages too. That booth is still carrying on business." I began to dig. She, after waiting a little and looking at me, sat down beside me and began to help me. We worked in silence. I cannot say now whether I thought at that moment of the criminal code, of morality, of proprietorship, and all the other things about which, in the opinion of many experienced persons, one ought to think every moment of one's life. Wishing to keep as close to the truth as possible, I must confess that apparently I was so deeply engaged in digging under the crate that I completely forgot about everything else except this one thing. What could be inside that crate? The evening drew on. The gray, mouldy, cold fog grew thicker and thicker around us. The waves roared with a hollower sound than before, and the rain pattered down on the boards of that crate more loudly and more frequently. Somewhere or other the night watchman began springing his rattle. "Has it got a bottom or not?" softly inquired my assistant. I did not understand what she was talking about, and I kept silence. "I say, has the crate got a bottom? If it has, we shall try in vain to break into it. Here we are digging a trench, and we may after all come upon nothing but solid boards. How should we take them off? Better smash the lock. It is a wretched lock." Good ideas rarely visit the heads of women, but as you see they do visit them sometimes. I have always valued good ideas, and have always tried to utilize them as far as possible. Having found the lock, I tugged at it and wrenched off the whole thing. My accomplice immediately stooped down and wriggled like a serpent into the gaping open, 4-cornered cover of the crate, whence she called to me approvingly, in a low tone, "You're a brick." Nowadays a little crumb of praise from a woman is dearer to me than a whole dithyramb from a man, even though he be more eloquent than all the ancient and modern orators put together. Then, however, I was less amiably disposed than I am now, and paying no attention to the compliment of my comrade, I asked her curtly and anxiously, "Is there anything?" In a monotonous tone she set about calculating our discoveries. "A basketful of bottles, thick furs, a sunshade, an iron pail." All this was uneatable. I felt that my hopes had vanished, but suddenly she exclaimed vivaciously, "Aha! Here it is!" "What?" "Bread! A loaf! It's only wet! Take it!" A loaf flew to my feet, and after it herself, my valiant comrade. I had already bitten off a morsel, stuffed it in my mouth, and was chewing it. "Come, give me some too! And we mustn't stay here. Where shall we go?" She looked inquiringly about on all sides. It was dark, wet, and boisterous. "Look! There's an upset canoe yonder. Let us go there." "Let us go, then." And off we set, demolishing our booty as we went, and filling our mouths with large portions of it. The rain grew more violent, the river roared, from somewhere or other resounded a prolonged mocking whistle, just as if someone great who feared nobody was whistling down all earthly institutions, and along with them this horrid autumnal wind and us its heroes. This whistling made my heart throb painfully, in spite of which I greedily went on eating, and in this respect the girl, walking on my left hand, kept even pace with me. "What do they call you?" I asked her. Why, I know not. "Natasha," she answered shortly, munching loudly. I stared at her. My heart ached within me, and then I stared into the mist before me, and it seemed to me as if the inimical countenance of my destiny was smiling at me, enigmatically and coldly. The rain scourged the timbers of the skiff incessantly, and its soft patter induced melancholy thoughts, and the wind whistled as it flew down into the boat's battered bottom through a rift where some loose splinters of wood were rattling together, a disquieting and depressing sound. The waves of the river were splashing on the shore, and sounded so monotonous and hopeless, just as if they were telling something unbearably dull and heavy which was boring them into utter disgust, something from which they wanted to run away and yet were obliged to talk about all the same. The sound of the rain blended with their splashing, and a long-drawn sigh seemed to be floating above the overturned skiff, the endless, laboring sigh of the earth, injured and exhausted by the eternal changes from the bright and warm summer to the cold, misty, and damp autumn. The wind blew continually over the desolate shore and the foaming river, blew and sang its melancholy songs. Our position beneath the shelter of the skiff was utterly devoid of comfort. It was narrow and damp. Tiny cold drops of rain dribbled through the damaged bottom. Gusts of wind penetrated it. We sat in silence and shivered with cold. I remembered that I wanted to go to sleep. Natasha leaned her back against the hull of the boat and curled herself up into a tiny ball. Embracing her knees with her hands and resting her chin upon them, she stared doggedly at the river with wide-open eyes. On the pale patch of her face they seemed immense because of the blue marks below them. She never moved, and this immobility and silence, I felt it, gradually produced within me a terror of my neighbor. I wanted to talk to her, but I knew not how to begin. It was she herself who spoke. "What a cursed thing life is!" she exclaimed plainly, abstractly, and in a tone of deep conviction. But this was no complaint. In these words there was too much of indifference for a complaint. This simple soul thought according to her understanding, thought and proceeded to form a certain conclusion which she expressed aloud, and which I could not confute for fear of contradicting myself. Therefore I was silent, and she, as if she had not noticed me, continued to sit there immovable. "Even if we croaked, what then?" Natasha began again, this time quietly and reflectively, and still there was not one note of complaint in her words. It was plain that this person, in the course of her reflections on life, was regarding her own case, and had arrived at the conviction that in order to preserve herself from the mockeries of life, she was not in a position to do anything else but simply croak, to use her own expression. The clearness of this line of thought was inexpressibly sad and painful to me, and I felt that if I kept silence any longer I was really bound to weep, and it would have been shameful to have done this before a woman, especially as she was not weeping herself. I resolved to speak to her. "Who was it that knocked you about?" I asked. For the moment I could not think of anything more sensible or more delicate. "Pashka did it all," she answered in a dull and level tone. "And who is he?" "My lover. He was a baker." "Did he beat you often?" "Whenever he was drunk, he beat me, often." And suddenly, turning towards me, she began to talk about herself, Pashka, and their mutual relations. He was a baker with red moustaches, and played very well on the banjo. He came to see her and greatly pleased her, for he was a merry chap and wore nice, clean clothes. He had a vest which cost 15 roubles and boots with dress tops. For these reasons she had fallen in love with him, and he became her creditor. And when he became her creditor, he made it his business to take away from her the money which her other friends gave to her for bonbons, and, getting drunk on this money, he would fall to beating her. But that would have been nothing if he hadn't also begun to run after other girls before her very eyes. "Now wasn't that an insult? I am not worse than the others. Of course that meant that he was laughing at me, the blackguard. The day before yesterday I asked leave of my mistress to go out for a bit, went to him, and there I found Dimka sitting beside him drunk. And he too was half seas over. I said, 'You scoundrel, you!' And he gave me a thorough hiding. He kicked me and dragged me by the hair, but that was nothing to what came after. He spoiled everything I had on, left me just as I am now. How could I appear before my mistress? He spoiled everything, my dress and my jacket, too. It was quite a new one. I gave a 5 for it, and tore my kerchief from my hand. Oh, Lord, what will become of me now?" she suddenly whined in a lamentable, overstrained voice. The wind howled and became ever colder and more boisterous. Again my teeth began to dance up and down, and she, huddled up to avoid the cold, pressed as closely to me as she could, so that I could see the gleam of her eyes through the darkness. "What wretches all you men are! I'd burn you all in an oven. I'd cut you in pieces. If any one of you was dying, I'd spit in his mouth, and not pity him a bit. Mean skunks! You wheedle and wheedle, you wag your tails like cringing dogs, and we fools give ourselves up to you, and it's all up with us. Immediately you trample us underfoot. Miserable loafers!" She cursed us up and down, but there was no vigor, no malice, no hatred of these miserable loafers in her cursing that I could hear. The tone of her language by no means corresponded with its subject matter, for it was calm enough, and the gamut of her voice was terribly poor. Yet all this made a stronger impression on me than the most eloquent and convincing pessimistic books and speeches, of which I had read a good many and which I still read to this day. And this, you see, was because the agony of a dying person is much more natural and violent than the most minute and picturesque descriptions of death. I felt really wretched, more from cold than from the words of my neighbor. I groaned softly and ground my teeth. Almost at the same moment I felt two little arms about me. One of them touched my neck, and the other lay upon my face, and at the same time an anxious, gentle, friendly voice uttered the question, "What ails you?" I was ready to believe that someone else was asking me this, and not Natasha, who had just declared that all men were scoundrels, and expressed a wish for their destruction. But she it was, and now she began speaking quickly, hurriedly. "What ails you, eh? Are you cold? Are you frozen? Ah, what a one you are, sitting there so silent like a little owl. Why, you should have told me long ago that you were cold. Come, lie on the ground. Stretch yourself out, and I will lie there. How's that? Now put your arms round me. Tighter. How's that? You shall be warm very soon now, and then we'll lie back to back. The night will pass so quickly, see if it won't. I say, have you two been drinking? Turned out of your place, eh? It doesn't matter." And she comforted me. She encouraged me. May I be thrice accursed! What a world of irony was in this single fact for me. Just imagine. Here was I, seriously occupied at this very time with the destiny of humanity, thinking of the reorganization of the social system, of political revolutions, reading all sorts of devilishly wise books whose abysmal profundity was certainly unfathomable by their very authors at this very time. I say, I was trying with all my might to make of myself a potent active social force. It even seemed to me that I had partially accomplished my object. Anyhow, at this time, in my ideas about myself, I had got so far as to recognize that I had an exclusive right to exist, that I had the necessary greatness to deserve to live my life, and that I was fully competent to play a great historical part therein. And a woman was now worming me with her body, a wretched, battered, hunted creature who had no place and no value in life, and whom I had never thought of helping till she helped me herself, and whom I really would not have known how to help in any way even if the thought of it had occurred to me. Ah, I was ready to think that this was all happening to me in a dream, in a disagreeable, an oppressive dream. But ugh! It was impossible for me to think that, for cold drops of rain were dripping down upon me, the woman was pressing close to me, her warm breath was fanning my face, and, despite a slight odor of vodka, it did me good. The wind howled and raged, the rain smote upon the skiff, the waves splashed, and both of us, embracing each other convulsively, nevertheless shivered with cold. All this was only too real, and I am certain that nobody ever dreamed such an oppressive and horrid dream as that reality. But Natasha was talking all the time of something or other, talking kindly and sympathetically, as only women can talk. Beneath the influence of her voice and kindly words, a little fire began to burn up within me, and something inside my heart thawed in consequence. Then tears poured from my eyes like a hailstorm, washing away from my heart much that was evil, much that was stupid, much sorrow and dirt which had fastened upon it before that night. Natasha comforted me. "Come, come, that will do, little one. Don't take on. That'll do. God will give you another chance. You will right yourself and stand in your proper place again, and it will be all right." And she kept kissing me. Many kisses did she give me, burning kisses, and all for nothing. Those were the first kisses from a woman that had ever been bestowed upon me, and they were the best kisses, too, for all the subsequent kisses cost me frightfully dear, and really gave me nothing at all in exchange. "Come, Don't take on so, funny one. I'll manage for you tomorrow if you cannot find a place. Her quiet, pervasive whispering sounded in my ears as if it came through a dream. There we lay till dawn. And when the dawn came, we crept from behind the skiff and went into the town. Then we took friendly leave of each other and never met again, although for half a year I searched in every hole and corner for that kind Natasha, with whom I spent the autumn night just described. If she be already dead, and well for her if it were so, may she rest in peace, and if she be alive, still I say, peace to her soul, and may the consciousness of her fall never enter her soul, for that would be a superfluous and fruitless suffering, if life is to be lived. The End of One Autumn Night by Maxim Gorky. Recording by Mark Penfold. Lincoln, Nebraska.
Chapter 19 of Best Russian Short Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. Best Russian Short Stories, edited and compiled by Thomas Seltzer. Chapter 19, entitled Her Lover, by Maxim Gorky. An acquaintance of mine once told me the following story. When I was a student at Moscow, I happened to live alongside one of those ladies whose repute is questionable. She was a Pole, and they called her Teresa. She was a tallish, powerfully built brunette, with black bushy eyebrows and a large coarse face as if carved out by a hatchet. The bestial gleam of her dark eyes, her thick bass voice, her cabman-like gait, and her immense muscular vigor, worthy of a fishwife, inspired me with horror. I lived on the top flight, and her garret was opposite to mine. I never left my door open when I knew her to be at home, but this, after all, was a very rare occurrence. Sometimes I chanced to meet her on the staircase or in the yard, and she would smile upon me with a smile which seemed to me to be sly and cynical. Occasionally I saw her drunk, with bleary eyes, tousled hair, and a particularly hideous grin. On such occasions she would speak to me. "How do you do, Mr. Student?" And her stupid laugh would still further intensify my loathing of her. I should have liked to have changed my quarters in order to have avoided such encounters and greetings, but my little chamber was a nice one, and there was such a wide view from the window, and it was always so quiet in the street below. So I endured. And one morning I was sprawling on my couch, trying to find some sort of excuse for not attending my class, when the door opened, and the bass voice of Teresa the Loathsome resounded from my threshold. "Good health to you, Mr. Student." "What do you want?" I said. I saw that her face was confused and supplicatory. It was a very unusual sort of face for her. "Sir, I want to beg a favor of you. Will you grant it me?" I lay there silent, and thought to myself, "Gracious, courage, my boy." "I want to send a letter home, that's what it is," she said. Her voice was beseeching, soft, timid. "Deuce take you," I thought, but up I jumped, sat down at my table, took a sheet of paper, and said, "Come here, sit down and dictate." She came, sat down very gingerly on a chair, and looked at me with a guilty look. "Well, to whom do you want to write?" "To Boleslav Kashput, at the town of Svietpitsiana on the Warsaw Road." "Well, fire away." "My dear Boles, my darling, my faithful lover, may the Mother of God protect thee. Thou heart of gold, why hast thou not written for such a long time to thy sorrowing little dove, Teresa?" I very nearly burst out laughing. A sorrowing little dove, more than 5 feet high, with fists a stone and more in weight, and as black a face as if the little dove had lived all its life in a chimney and had never once washed itself. Restraining myself somehow, I asked, "Who is this Bolus?" "Bolus, Mr. Student," she said, as if offended with me for blundering over the name. "He is Bolus, my young man." "Young man?" "Why are you so surprised, sir? Cannot I, a girl, have a young man?" She, a girl? Well. "Oh, why not?" I said. "All things are possible. And has he been your young man long?" 6 years. "Oh-ho," I thought. "Well, let us write your letter." And I tell you plainly that I would willingly have changed places with this Bolus if his fair correspondent had been not Teresa, but something less than she. "I thank you most heartily, sir, for your kind services," said Teresa to me with a curtsy. "Perhaps I can show you some service, eh?" "No, I most humbly thank you all the same." "Perhaps, sir, your shirts or your trousers may want a little mending?" I felt that this mastodon in petticoats had made me grow quite red with shame, and I told her pretty sharply that I had no need whatever of her services. She departed. A week or two passed away. It was evening. I was sitting at my window whistling and thinking of some expedient for enabling me to get away from myself. I was bored. The weather was dirty. I didn't want to go out, and out of sheer ennui I began a course of self-analysis and reflection. This also was dull enough work, but I didn't care about doing anything else. Then the door opened. Heaven be praised! Someone came in. "Oh, Mr. Student, you have no pressing business, I hope?" It was Teresa. Humph! "No, what is it?" "I was going to ask you, sir, to write me another letter." "Very well. To Bolus, eh?" "No, this time it is from him." "What?" "Stupid that I am. It is not for me, Mr. Student. I beg your pardon. It is for a friend of mine. That is to say, not a friend, but an acquaintance. A man acquaintance. He has a sweetheart just like me here, Teresa. That's how it is. Will you, sir, write a letter to this Teresa?" I looked at her. Her face was troubled, her fingers were trembling. I was a bit fogged at first, and then I guessed how it was. "Look here, my lady," I said. "There are no Boluses or Teresas at all, and you've been telling me a pack of lies. Don't you come sneaking about me any longer. I have no wish whatever to cultivate your acquaintance. Do you understand?" And suddenly she grew strangely terrified and distraught. She began to shift from foot to foot without moving from the place, and spluttered comically, as if she wanted to say something and couldn't. I waited to see what would come of all this, and I saw and felt that, apparently, I had made a great mistake in suspecting her of wishing to draw me from the path of righteousness. It was evidently something very different. "Mr. Student," she began, and suddenly, waving her hand, she turned abruptly towards the door and went out. I remained with a very unpleasant feeling in my mind. I listened. Her door was flung violently to. Plainly the poor wench was very angry. I thought it over, and resolved to go to her, and, inviting her to come in here, write everything she wanted. I entered her apartment. I looked round. She was sitting at the table, leaning on her elbows, with her head in her hands. "Listen to me," I said. Now, whenever I come to this point in my story, I always feel horribly awkward and idiotic. Well, well. "Listen to me," I said. She leaped from her seat, came towards me with flashing eyes, and laying her hands on my shoulders began to whisper, or rather to hum in her peculiar bass voice. "Look you now, it's like this. There's no Bolus at all, and there's no Teresa either. But what's that to you? is it a hard thing for you to draw your pen over paper? Eh? Ah, and you, too. Still such a little fair-haired boy. There's nobody at all, neither Bolus nor Teresa, only me. There you have it, and much good may it do you. Pardon me, said I, altogether flabbergasted by such a reception. What is it all about? There's no Bolus, you say? No, so it is. And no Teresa either? And no Teresa. I'm Teresa. I didn't understand it at all. I fixed my eyes upon her, and tried to make out which of us was taking leave of his or her senses. But she went again to the table, searched about for something, came back to me, and said in an offended tone, If it was so hard for you to write to Bolus, look, there's your letter, take it. Others will write for me. I looked. In her hand was my letter to Bolus. Phew! Listen, Teresa, what is the meaning of all this? Why must you get others to write for you when I have already written it, and you haven't sent it? Sent it where? Why, to this Bolus. There's no such person. I absolutely did not understand it. There was nothing for me but to spit and go. Then she explained. What is it? She said, still offended. There's no such person, I tell you. And she extended her arms as if she herself did not understand why there should be no such person. But I wanted him to be. Am I then not a human creature like the rest of them? Yes, I know, of course. Yet no harm was done to any one by my writing to him that I can see. Pardon me? To whom? To Bolus, of course. But he doesn't exist? Alas, alas, but what if he doesn't? He doesn't exist, but he might. I write to him, and it looks as if he did exist. And Teresa, that's me, and he replies to me, and then I write to him again. I understood at last, and I felt so sick, so miserable, so ashamed somehow. Alongside of me, not 3 yards away, lived a human creature who had nobody in the world to treat her kindly, affectionately, and this human being had invented a friend for herself. Look now, you wrote me a letter to Bolus, and I gave it to someone else to read it to me. And when they read it to me, I listened and fancied that Bolus was there. And I asked you to write me a letter from Bolus to Teresa, that is, to me. When they write such a letter for me, and read it to me, I feel quite sure that Bolus is there, and life grows easier for me in consequence. Deuce take you for a blockhead, said I to myself when I heard this. And from thenceforth, regularly, twice a week, I wrote a letter to Bolus, and an answer from Bolus to Teresa. I wrote those answers well. She, of course, listened to them, and wept like anything, roared, I should say, with her bass voice. And in return for my thus moving her to tears by real letters from the imaginary Bolus, she began to mend the holes I had in my socks, shirts, and other articles of clothing. Subsequently, about 3 months after this history began, they put her in prison for something or other. No doubt by this time she is dead. My acquaintance shook the ash from his cigarette, looked pensively up at the sky, and thus concluded. Well, the more a human creature has tasted of bitter things, the more it hungers after the sweet things of life. And we, wrapped round in the rags of our virtues, and regarding others through the mist of our self-sufficiency, and persuaded of our universal impeccability, do not understand this. And the whole thing turns out pretty stupidly, and very cruelly. The falling classes, we say, And who are the falling classes, I should like to know? They are, first of all, people with the same bones, flesh, and blood and nerves as ourselves. We have been told this day after day for ages. And we actually listen, and the devil only knows how hideous the whole thing is. Or are we completely depraved by the loud sermonizing of humanism? In reality, we also are fallen folks, and so far as I can see, very deeply fallen into the abyss of self-sufficiency and the conviction of our own superiority. But enough of this. It is all as old as the hills, so old that it is a shame to speak of it. Very old indeed. Yes, that's what it is. End of Her Lover by Maxim Gorky.
Chapter 20 of Best Russian Short Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Algy Pug, Perth, Western Australia. Best Russian Short Stories, edited and compiled by Thomas Seltzer. Lazarus, Eleazar, by Leonid Andreev. 1. When Lazarus rose from the grave, after 3 days and nights in the mysterious thraldom of death, and returned alive to his home, it was a long time before anyone noticed the evil peculiarities in him that were later to make his very name terrible. His friends and relatives were jubilant that he had come back to life. They surrounded him with tenderness, they were lavish of their eager attentions, spending the greatest care upon his food and drink and the new garments they made for him. They clad him gorgeously in the glowing colours of hope and laughter, and when, arrayed like a bridegroom, he sat at table with them again, ate again, and drank again, they wept fondly and summoned the neighbours to look upon the man miraculously raised from the dead. The neighbours came and were moved with joy. Strangers arrived from distant cities and villages to worship the miracle. They burst into stormy exclamations and buzzed around the house of Mary and Martha like so many bees. That which was new in Lazarus's face and gestures they explained naturally, as the traces of his severe illness and the shock he had passed through. It was evident that the disintegration of the body had been halted by miraculous power, but that the restoration had not been complete. That death had left upon his face and body the effect of an artist's unfinished sketch seen through a thin glass. On his temples, under his eyes, and in the hollow of his cheek lay a thick earthy blue. His fingers were blue too, and under his nails, which had grown long in the grave, the blue had turned livid. Here and there on his lips and body the skin, blistered in the grave, had burst open and left reddish glistening cracks, as if covered with a thin glassy slime. And he had grown exceedingly stout. His body was horribly bloated and suggested the fetid damp smell of putrefaction. But the cadaverous heavy odour that clung to his burial garments and, as it seemed, to his very body, soon wore off, and after some time the blue of his hands and face softened, and the reddish cracks of his skin smoothed out, though they never disappeared completely. Such was the aspect of Lazarus in his second life. It looked natural only to those who had seen him buried. Not merely Lazarus's face, but his very character, it seemed, had changed, though it astonished no one and did not attract the attention it deserved. Before his death, Lazarus had been cheerful and careless, a lover of laughter and harmless jest. It was because of his good humour, pleasant and equable, his freedom from meanness and gloom, that he had been so beloved by the Master. Now he was grave and silent. Neither he himself jested, nor did he laugh at the jests of others, and the words he spoke occasionally were simple, ordinary, and necessary words, words as much devoid of sense and depth as are the sounds with which an animal expresses pain and pleasure, thirst and hunger. Such words a man may speak all his life, and no one would ever know the sorrows and joys that dwelt within him. Thus it was that Lazarus sat at the festive table among his friends and relatives, his face the face of a corpse, over which, for 3 days, death had reigned in darkness, his garments gorgeous and festive, glittering with gold, bloody red and purple, his mien heavy and silent. He was horribly changed and strange, but as yet undiscovered. In high waves, now mild, now stormy, the festivities went on around him. Warm glances of love caressed his face, still cold with the touch of the grave, and a friend's warm hand patted his bluish heavy hand. And the music played joyous tunes mingled with the sounds of the tympanum, the pipe, the zither, and the dulcimer. It was as if bees were humming, locusts buzzing, and birds singing over the happy home of Mary and Martha. 2. Someone recklessly lifted the veil. By one breath of an uttered word, he destroyed the serene charm and uncovered the truth in its ugly nakedness. No thought was clearly defined in his mind when his lips smilingly asked, "Why do you not tell us, Lazarus, what was there?" And all became silent, struck with the question. Only now it seemed to have occurred to them that for 3 days Lazarus had been dead, and they looked with curiosity, awaiting an answer. But Lazarus remained silent. "You will not tell us?" wondered the inquirer. "Is it so terrible there?" Again his thought lagged behind his words. Had it preceded them, he would not have asked the question, for, at the very moment he uttered it, his heart sank with a dread fear. All grew restless. They awaited the words of Lazarus anxiously. But he was silent, cold and severe, and his eyes were cast down. And now, as if for the first time, they perceived the horrible bluishness of his face and the loathsome corpulence of his body. On the table, as if forgotten by Lazarus, lay his livid blue hand, and all eyes were riveted upon it, as though expecting the desired answer from that hand. The musicians still played, then silence fell upon them too, and the gay sounds died down, as scattered coals are extinguished by water. The pipe became mute, and the ringing tympanum and the murmuring dulcimer, and as though a chord were broken, as though song itself were dying, the zither echoed a trembling, broken sound. Then all was quiet. "You will not?" repeated the inquirer, unable to restrain his babbling tongue. Silence reigned, and the livid blue hand lay motionless. It moved slightly, and the company sighed with relief and raised their eyes. Lazarus, risen from the dead, was looking straight at them, embracing all with one glance, heavy and terrible. This was on the 3rd day after Lazarus had arisen from the grave. Since then many had felt that his gaze was the gaze of destruction, but neither those who had been for ever crushed by it, nor those who in the prime of life, mysterious even as death, had found the will to resist his glance, could ever explain the terror that lay immovable in the depths of his black pupils. He looked quiet and simple. One felt that he had no intention to hide anything, but also no intention to tell anything. His look was cold, as of one who is entirely indifferent to all that is alive, and many careless people who pressed around him and did not notice him later learned with wonder and fear the name of this stout, quiet man who brushed against them with his sumptuous, gaudy garments. The sun did not stop shining when he looked, neither did the fountain cease playing, and the eastern sky remained cloudless and blue as always. But the man who fell under his inscrutable gaze could no longer feel the sun, nor hear the fountain, nor recognize his native sky. Sometimes he would cry bitterly, sometimes tear his hair in despair and madly call for help. But generally it happened that the men thus stricken by the gaze of Lazarus began to fade away listlessly and quietly, and passed into a slow death lasting many long years. They died in the presence of everybody, colourless, haggard, and gloomy, like trees withering on rocky ground. Those who screamed in madness sometimes came back to life, but the others never. "So you will not tell us, Lazarus, what you saw there?" the inquirer repeated for the third time. But now his voice was dull, and a dead grey weariness looked stupidly from out his eyes. The faces of all present were also covered by the same dead grey weariness like a mist. The guests stared at one another stupidly, not knowing why they had come together, or why they sat around this rich table. They stopped talking, and vaguely felt it was time to leave, but they could not overcome the lassitude that spread through their muscles. So they continued to sit there, each one isolated, like little dim lights scattered in the darkness of night. The musicians were paid to play, and they again took up the instruments, and again played gay or mournful airs. But it was music made to order, always the same tunes, and the guests listened wonderingly. Why was this music necessary, they thought? Why was it necessary, and what good did it do for people to pull at strings and blow their cheeks into thin pipes and produce varied and strange-sounding noises? "How badly they play," said someone. The musicians were insulted and left. Then the guests departed one by one, for it was nearing night. And when the quiet darkness enveloped them, and it became easier to breathe, the image of Lazarus suddenly arose before each one in stern splendour. There he stood, with the blue face of a corpse and the raiment of a bridegroom, sumptuous and resplendent. In his eyes that cold stare, in the depths of which lurked the horrible. They stood still as if turned into stone. The darkness surrounded them, and in the midst of this darkness flamed up the horrible apparition, the supernatural vision of the one who for 3 days had lain under the measureless power of death. 3 days he had been dead. Thrice had the sun risen and set, and he had lain dead. The children had played, the water had murmured as it streamed over the rocks, the hot dust had clouded the highway, and he had been dead. And now he was among men again, touched them, looked at them, and through the black rings of his pupils, as through dark glasses, the unfathomable there gazed upon humanity. 3. No one took care of Lazarus, and no friends or kindred remained with him. Only the great desert, enfolding the holy city, came close to the threshold of his abode. It entered his home, and lay down on his couch like a spouse, and put out all the fires. No one cared for Lazarus. One after the other went away, even his sisters Mary and Martha. For a long while Martha did not want to leave him, for she knew not who would nurse him or take care of him, and she cried and prayed. But one night, when the wind was roaming about the desert, and the rustling cypress trees were bending over the roof, she dressed herself quietly, and quietly went away. Lazarus probably heard how the door was slammed. It had not shut properly, and the wind kept knocking it continually against the post. But he did not rise, did not go out, did not try to find out the reason. And the whole night until the morning the cypress trees hissed over his head, and the door swung to and fro, allowing the cold, greedily prowling desert to enter his dwelling. Everybody shunned him as though he were a leper. They wanted to put a bell on his neck to avoid meeting him. But someone, turning pale, remarked it would be terrible if at night, under the windows, one should happen to hear Lazarus's bell. And all grew pale and dissented. Since he did nothing for himself, he would probably have starved, had not his neighbours, in trepidation, saved some food for him. Children brought it to him. They did not fear him, neither did they laugh at him in the innocent cruelty in which children often laugh at unfortunates. They were indifferent to him, and Lazarus showed the same indifference to them. He showed no desire to thank them for their services. He did not try to pat the dark hands and look into the simple shining little eyes. Abandoned to the ravages of time and the desert, his house was falling to ruins, and his hungry, bleating goats had long been scattered among his neighbours. His wedding garments had grown old. He wore them without changing them, as he had donned them on that happy day when the musicians played. He did not see the difference between old and new, between torn and whole. The brilliant colours were burnt and faded. The vicious dogs of the city and the sharp thorns of the desert had rent the fine clothes to shreds. During the day, when the sun beat down mercilessly upon all living things, and even the scorpions hid under the stones, convulsed with a mad desire to sting, he sat motionless in the burning rays, lifting high his blue face and shaggy wild beard. While yet the people were unafraid to speak to him, someone had asked him, "Poor Lazarus, do you find it pleasant to sit so and look at the sun?" And he answered, "Yes, it is pleasant." The thought suggested itself to people that the cold of the 3 days in the grave had been so intense, its darkness so deep, that there was not in all the earth enough heat or light to warm Lazarus and lighten the gloom of his eyes, and inquirers turned away with a sigh. And when the setting sun, flat and purple-red, descended to earth, Lazarus went into the desert and walked straight toward it, as though intending to reach it. Always he walked directly toward the sun, and those who tried to follow him and find out what he did at night in the desert had indelibly imprinted upon their mind's vision the black silhouette of a tall, stout man against the red background of an immense disk. The horrors of the night drove them away, and so they never found out what Lazarus did in the desert. But the image of the black form against the red was burned for ever into their brains. Like an animal with a cinder in its eye, which furiously rubs its muzzle against its paws, they foolishly rubbed their eyes. But the impression left by Lazarus was ineffaceable, forgotten only in death. There were people living far away who never saw Lazarus and only heard of him. With an audacious curiosity which is stronger than fear and feeds on fear, with a secret sneer in their hearts, some of them came to him one day as he basked in the sun, and entered into conversation with him. At that time his appearance had changed for the better, and was not so frightful. At first the visitors snapped their fingers and thought disapprovingly of the foolish inhabitants of the holy city. But when the short talk came to an end, and they went home, their expression was such that the inhabitants of the holy city at once knew their errand, and said, "Here goes some more madmen at whom Lazarus has looked." The speakers raised their hands in silent pity. Other visitors came, among them brave warriors in clinking armour, who knew not fear, and happy youths who made merry with laughter and song. Busy merchants, jingling their coins, ran in for a while, and proud attendants at the temple placed their staffs at Lazarus's door. But no one returned the same as he came. A frightful shadow fell upon their souls, and gave a new appearance to the old familiar world. Those who felt any desire to speak after they had been stricken by the gaze of Lazarus described the change that had come over them somewhat like this. All objects seen by the eye and palpable to the hand became empty, light, and transparent, as though they were light shadows in the darkness, and this darkness enveloped the whole universe. It was dispelled neither by the sun, nor by the moon, nor by the stars, but embraced the earth like a mother, and clothed it in a boundless black veil. Into all bodies it penetrated, even into iron and stone, and the particles of the body lost their unity and became lonely. Even to the heart of the particles it penetrated, and the particles of the particles became lonely. The vast emptiness which surrounds the universe was not filled with things seen, with sun or moon or stars. It stretched boundless, penetrating everywhere, disuniting everything, body from body, particle from particle. In emptiness the trees spread their roots, themselves empty. In emptiness rose phantom temples, palaces, and houses, all empty. and in the emptiness moved restless man, himself empty and light, like a shadow. There was no more a sense of time. The beginning of all things and their end merged into one. In the same moment when a building was being erected and one could hear the builders striking with their hammers, one seemed already to see its ruins and then emptiness where the ruins were. A man was just born, and funeral candles were already lighted at his head, and then were extinguished, and soon there was emptiness where before had been the man and the candles. And surrounded by darkness and empty waste, man trembled hopelessly before the dread of the infinite. So spoke those who had a desire to speak, but much more could probably have been told by those who did not want to talk, and who died in silence. 4. At that time there lived in Rome a celebrated sculptor by the name of Aurelius. Out of clay, marble, and bronze he created forms of gods and men of such beauty that this beauty was proclaimed immortal. But he himself was not satisfied, and said there was a supreme beauty that he had never succeeded in expressing in marble or bronze. "I have not yet gathered the radiance of the moon," he said. "I have not yet caught the glare of the sun. There is no soul in my marble, there is no life in my beautiful bronze." And when by moonlight he would slowly wander along the roads, crossing the black shadows of the cypress trees, his white tunic flashing in the moonlight, those he met used to laugh good-naturedly and say, "Is it moonlight you are gathering, Aurelius? Why did you not bring some baskets along?" And he too would laugh and point to his eyes and say, "Here are the baskets in which I gather the light of the moon and the radiance of the sun." And that was the truth. In his eyes shone moon and sun. But he could not transmit the radiance to marble. Therein lay the greatest tragedy of his life. He was a descendant of an ancient race of patricians, had a good wife and children, and, except in this one respect, lacked nothing. When the dark rumour about Lazarus reached him, he consulted his wife and friends and decided to make the long voyage to Judea in order that he might look upon the man miraculously raised from the dead. He felt lonely in those days and hoped on the way to renew his jaded energies. What they told him about Lazarus did not frighten him. He had meditated much upon death. He did not like it, nor did he like those who tried to harmonize it with life. On this side, beautiful life. On the other, mysterious death, he reasoned. And no better lot could befall a man than to live, to enjoy life and the beauty of living. And he already had conceived a desire to convince Lazarus of the truth of this view, and to return his soul to life, even as his body had been returned. This task did not appear impossible, for the reports about Lazarus, fearsome and strange as they were, did not tell the whole truth about him, but only carried a vague warning against something awful. Lazarus was getting up from a stone to follow in the path of the setting sun on the evening when the rich Roman, accompanied by an armed slave, approached him and in a ringing voice called to him, "Lazarus!" Lazarus saw a proud and beautiful face, made radiant by fame, and white garments and precious jewels shining in the sunlight. The ruddy rays of the sun lent to the head and face a likeness to dimly shining bronze. That was what Lazarus saw. He sank back to his seat obediently, and wearily lowered his eyes. "It is true you are not beautiful, my poor Lazarus," said the Roman quietly, playing with his gold chain. "You are even frightful, my poor friend, and death was not lazy the day that you so carelessly fell into its arms. But you are as fat as a barrel, and fat people are not bad, as the great Caesar said. I do not understand why people are so afraid of you. You will permit me to stay with you overnight? It is already late, and I have no abode." No one had ever asked Lazarus to be allowed to pass the night with him. "I have no bed," said he. "I am somewhat of a warrior, and can sleep sitting," replied the Roman. "We shall make a light." "I have no light." Then we will converse in the darkness like two friends. I suppose you have some wine?" "I have no wine." The Roman laughed. "Now I understand why you are so gloomy, and why you do not like your second life. No wine? Well, we shall do without. You know there are words that go to one's head even as Falernian wine." With a motion of his head he dismissed the slave, and they were alone. Again the sculptor spoke, but it seemed as though the sinking sun had penetrated into his words. They faded, pale and empty, as if trembling on weak feet, as if slipping and falling, drunk with the wine of anguish and despair. And black chasms appeared between the two men, like remote hints of vast emptiness and vast darkness. "Now I am your guest, and you will not ill-treat me, Lazarus," said the Roman. "Hospitality is binding even upon those who have been 3 days dead. 3 days, I am told, you were in the grave. It must have been cold there, and it is from there that you have brought this bad habit of doing without light and wine. I like a light. It gets dark so quickly here. Your eyebrows and forehead have an interesting line, even as the ruins of castles covered with the ashes of an earthquake. But why in such strange ugly clothes? I have seen the bridegrooms of your country. They wear clothes like that. Such ridiculous clothes, such awful garments. Are you a bridegroom?" Already the sun had disappeared. A gigantic black shadow was approaching fast from the west, as if prodigious bare feet were rustling over the sand, and the chill breezes stole up behind. "In the darkness you seem even bigger, Lazarus, as though you had grown stouter in these few minutes. Do you feed on darkness, perchance? And I would like a light, just a small light, just a small light. And I am cold. The nights here are so barbarously cold. If it were not so dark, I should say you were looking at me, Lazarus. Yes, it seems, you are looking. You are looking, you are looking at me. I feel it. Now you were smiling." The night had come, and a heavy blackness filled the air. "How good it will be when the sun rises again tomorrow! You know I am a great sculptor. So my friends call me. I create, yes, they say I create, but for that daylight is necessary. I give life to cold marble. I melt the ringing bronze in the fire, in a bright hot fire. Why did you touch me with your hand?" "Come," said Lazarus, "you are my guest." And they went into the house, and the shadows of the long evening fell on the earth. The slave at last grew tired waiting for his master, and when the sun stood high he came to the house, and he saw, directly under its burning rays, Lazarus and his master sitting close together. They looked straight up and were silent. The slave wept and cried aloud, "Master, what ails you, master?" The same day Aurelius left for Rome. The whole way he was thoughtful and silent, attentively examining everything, the people, the ship, and the sea, as though endeavouring to recall something. On the sea a great storm overtook them, and all the while Aurelius remained on deck and gazed eagerly at the approaching and falling waves. When he reached home, his family was shocked at the terrible change in his demeanour, but he calmed them with the words, "I have found it." In the dusty clothes which he had worn during the entire journey, and had not changed, he began his work, and the marble ringingly responded to the resounding blows of the hammer. Long and eagerly he worked, admitting no one. At last, one evening, he announced that the work was ready, and gave instructions that all his friends, and the severe critics and judges of art, be called together. Then he donned gorgeous garments, shining with gold, glowing with the purple of the bison. "Here is what I have created," he said thoughtfully. His friends looked, and immediately the shadow of deep sorrow covered their faces. It was a thing monstrous, possessing none of the forms familiar to the eye, yet not devoid of a hint of some new unknown form. On a thin, tortuous little branch, or rather an ugly likeness of one, lay crooked, strange, unsightly, shapeless heaps of something turned outside in. or something turned inside out, wild fragments which seemed to be feebly trying to get away from themselves. And accidentally, under one of the wild projections, they noticed a wonderfully sculptured butterfly with transparent wings, trembling as though with a weak longing to fly. "Why that wonderful butterfly, Aurelius?" timidly asked someone. "I do not know," answered the sculptor. The truth had to be told, and one of his friends, the one who loved Aurelius best, said, "This is ugly, my poor friend. It must be destroyed. Give me the hammer." And with 2 blows he destroyed the monstrous mass, leaving only the wonderfully sculptured butterfly. After that, Aurelius created nothing. He looked with absolute indifference at marble and at bronze and at his own divine creations, in which dwelt immortal beauty. In the hope of breathing into him once again the old flame of inspiration, with the idea of awakening his dead soul, his friends led him to see the beautiful creations of others, but he remained indifferent, and no smile warmed his closed lips. And only after they spoke to him much and long of beauty, he would reply wearily, "But all this is a lie." And in the daytime, when the sun was shining, he would go into his rich and beautifully laid out garden, and finding a place where there was no shadow, would expose his bare head and his dull eyes to the glitter and burning heat of the sun. Red and white butterflies fluttered around. Down into the marble cistern ran splashing water from the crooked mouth of a blissfully drunken satyr. But he sat motionless, like a pale shadow of that other one who, in a far land, at the very gates of the stony desert, also sat motionless under the fiery sun. 5. And it came about finally that Lazarus was summoned to Rome by the great Augustus. They dressed him in gorgeous garments, as though it had been ordained that he was to remain a bridegroom to an unknown bride until the very day of his death. It was as if an old coffin, rotten and falling apart, were re-gilded over and over, and gay tassels were hung on it. And solemnly they conducted him in gala attire, as though in truth it were a bridal procession, the runners loudly sounding the trumpet that the way be made for the ambassadors of the emperor. But the roads along which he passed were deserted. His entire native land cursed the execrable name of Lazarus, the man miraculously brought to life, and the people scattered at the mere report of his horrible approach. The trumpeters blew lonely blasts, and only the desert answered with a dying echo. Then they carried him across the sea on the saddest and most gorgeous ship that was ever mirrored in the azure waves of the Mediterranean. There were many people aboard, but the ship was silent and still as a coffin, and the water seemed to moan as it parted before the short, curved prow. Lazarus sat lonely, bearing his head to the sun and listening in silence to the splashing of the waters. Further away the seamen and the ambassadors gathered like a crowd of distressed shadows. If a thunderstorm had happened to burst upon them at that time, or the wind had overwhelmed the red sails, the ship would probably have perished, for none of those who were on her had strength or desire enough to fight for life. With supreme effort some went to the side of the ship and eagerly gazed at the blue transparent abyss. Perhaps they imagined they saw a naiad flashing a pink shoulder through the waves, or an insanely joyous and drunken centaur galloping by, splashing up the water with his hooves. But the sea was deserted and mute, and so was the watery abyss. Listlessly Lazarus set foot on the streets of the eternal city, as though its riches, all the majesty of its gigantic edifices, all the lustre and beauty and music of refined life, were simply the echo of the wind in the desert, or the misty images of hot running sand. Chariots whirled by. The crowd of strong, beautiful, haughty men passed on, builders of the eternal city and proud partakers of its life. Songs rang out, fountains laughed, pearly laughter of women filled the air, while the drunkard philosophized and the sober ones smilingly listened. Horseshoes rattled on the pavement, and, surrounded on all sides by glad sounds, a fat, heavy man moved through the centre of the city like a cold spot of silence, sowing in his path grief, anger, and vague carking distress. Who dared to be sad in Rome? Indignantly demanded frowning citizens, and in 2 days the swift-tongued Rome knew of Lazarus, the man miraculously raised from the grave, and timidly evaded him. There were many brave men ready to try their strength, and at their senseless call Lazarus came obediently. The emperor was so engrossed with state affairs that he delayed receiving the visitor, and for 7 days Lazarus moved among the people. A jovial drunkard met him with a smile on his red lips. "Drink, Lazarus, drink!" he cried. "Would not Augustus laugh to see you drink?" And naked, besotted women laughed, and decked the blue hands of Lazarus with rose leaves. But the drunkard looked into the eyes of Lazarus, and his joy ended for ever. Thereafter he was always drunk. He drank no more, but was drunk all the time, shadowed by fearful dreams, instead of the joyous reveries that wine gives. Fearful dreams became the food of his broken spirit. Fearful dreams held him day and night in the midst of monstrous fantasy, and death itself was no more fearful than the apparition of its fierce precursor. Lazarus came to a youth and his lass who loved each other and were beautiful in their love. Proudly and strongly holding in his arms his beloved one, the youth said with gentle pity, "Look at us, Lazarus, and rejoice with us. Is there anything stronger than love?" And Lazarus looked at them, and their whole life they continued to love one another, but their love became mournful and gloomy, even as those cypress trees over the tombs that feed their roots on the putrescence of the grave, and strive in vain in the quiet evening hour to touch the sky with their pointed tops. Hurled by fathomless life forces into each other's arms, they mingled their kisses with tears, their joy with pain, and only succeeded in realizing the more vividly a sense of their slavery to the silent nothing. For ever united, for ever parted, they flashed like sparks, and like sparks went out in boundless darkness. Lazarus came to a proud sage, and the sage said to him, "I already know all the horrors that you may tell me, Lazarus. With what else can you terrify me?" Only a few moments passed before the sage realized that the knowledge of the horrible is not the horrible, and that the sight of death is not death. And he felt that, in the eyes of the infinite, wisdom and folly are the same, for the infinite knows them not. And the boundaries between knowledge and ignorance, between truth and falsehood, between top and bottom, faded, and his shapeless thought was suspended in emptiness. Then he grasped his grey head in his hands and cried out insanely, "I cannot think! I cannot think!" Thus it was that under the cool gaze of Lazarus, the man miraculously raised from the dead, all that serves to affirm life, its sense and its joys, perished. And the people began to say it was dangerous to allow him to see the emperor, that it were better to kill him and bury him secretly, and swear that he had disappeared. Swords were sharpened, and youths devoted to the welfare of the people announced their readiness to become assassins, when Augustus upset the cruel plans by demanding that Lazarus appear before him. Even though Lazarus could not be kept away, it was felt that the heavy impression conveyed by his face might be somewhat softened. With that end in view, expert painters, barbers and artists were secured who worked the whole night on Lazarus's head. His beard was trimmed and curled. The disagreeable and deadly bluishness of his hands and face was covered up with paint. His hands were whitened, his cheeks rouged. The disgusting wrinkles of suffering that ridged his old face were patched up and painted, and on the smooth surface wrinkles of good nature and laughter and of pleasant good-humoured cheeriness were laid on artistically with fine brushes. Lazarus submitted indifferently to all they did with him, and soon was transformed into a stout, nice-looking old man, for all the world a quiet and good-humoured grandfather of numerous grandchildren. He looked as though the smile with which he told funny stories had not left his lips, as though a quiet tenderness still lay hidden in the corner of his eyes. But the wedding dress they did not dare to take off, and they could not change his eyes, the dark, terrible eyes, from out of which stared the incomprehensible there. 6. Lazarus was untouched by the magnificence of the imperial apartments. he remained stolidly indifferent, as though he saw no contrast between his ruined house at the edge of the desert and the solid, beautiful palace of stone. Under his feet the hard marble of the floor took on the semblance of the moving sands of the desert, and to his eyes the throngs of gaily dressed, haughty men were as unreal as the emptiness of the air. They looked not into his face as he passed by, fearing to come under the awful bane of his eyes. But when the sound of his heavy steps announced that he had passed, heads were lifted, and eyes examined with timid curiosity the figure of the corpulent, tall, slightly stooping old man, as he slowly passed into the heart of the imperial palace. If death itself had appeared, men would have not feared it so much, for hitherto death had been known to the dead only, and life to the living only, and between these two there had been no bridge. But this strange being knew death, and that knowledge of his was felt to be mysterious and cursed. "He will kill our great divine Augustus," men cried with horror, and they hurled curses after him. Slowly and stolidly he passed them by, penetrating ever deeper into the palace. Caesar knew already who Lazarus was, and was prepared to meet him. He was a courageous man, he felt his power was invincible, and in the fateful encounter with the man wonderfully raised from the dead, he refused to lean on other men's weak help. Man to man, face to face, he met Lazarus. "Do not fix your gaze on me, Lazarus," he commanded. "I have heard that your head is like the head of Medusa, and turns into stone all upon whom you look. But I should like to have a close look at you, and to talk to you before I turn into stone," he added in a spirit of playfulness that concealed his real misgivings. Approaching him, he examined closely Lazarus's face and his strange festive clothes. Though his eyes were sharp and keen, he was deceived by the skilful counterfeit. "Well, your appearance is not terrible, venerable sir." "But all the worse for men, when the terrible takes on such a venerable and pleasant appearance. Now let us talk." Augustus sat down, and as much by glance as by words began the discussion. "Why did you not salute me when you entered?" Lazarus answered indifferently. "I did not know it was necessary." "You are a Christian?" "No." Augustus nodded approvingly. "That is good. I do not like the Christians. They shake the tree of life, forbidding it to bear fruit, and they scatter to the wind its fragrant blossoms. But who are you?" With some effort Lazarus answered, "I was dead." "I heard about that. But who are you now?" Lazarus's answer came slowly. Finally he said again, listlessly and indistinctly, "I was dead." "Listen to me, stranger," said the emperor sharply, giving expression to what had been in his mind before. "My empire is an empire of the living. My people are a people of the living and not of the dead. You are superfluous here. I do not know who you are. I do not know what you have seen there. But if you lie, I hate your lies, and if you tell the truth, I hate your truth. In my heart I feel the pulse of life. In my hands I feel power, and my proud thoughts, like eagles, fly through space. Behind my back, under the protection of my authority, under the shadow of the laws I have created, men live and labour and rejoice. Do you hear this divine harmony of life? Do you hear the war cry that men hurl into the face of the future, challenging it to strife?" Augustus extended his arms reverently and solemnly cried out, "Blessed art thou, great divine life!" But Lazarus was silent, and the emperor continued more severely, "You are not wanted here. Pitiful remnant, half devoured of death, you fill men with distress and aversion to life. Like a caterpillar on the fields, you are gnawing away at the full seed of joy, exuding the slime of despair and sorrow. Your truth is like a rusted sword in the hands of a night assassin, and I shall condemn you to death as an assassin. But first I want to look into your eyes. Mayhap only cowards fear them, and brave men are spurred on to struggle and victory. Then will you merit not death, but a reward." Look at me, Lazarus." At first it seemed to divine Augustus as if a friend were looking at him. So soft, so alluring, so gently fascinating was the gaze of Lazarus. It promised not horror, but quiet rest, and the Infinite dwelt there as a fond mistress, a compassionate sister, a mother. And ever stronger grew its gentle embrace, until he felt, as it were, the breath of a mouth hungry for kisses. Then it seemed as if iron bones protruded in a ravenous grip and closed upon him in an iron band, and cold nails touched his heart, and slowly, slowly sank into it. "It pains me," said divine Augustus, growing pale. "But look, Lazarus, look!" Ponderous gates, shutting off eternity, appeared to be slowly swinging open, and through the growing aperture poured in, coldly and calmly, the awful horror of the infinite. Boundless emptiness and boundless gloom entered like two shadows, extinguishing the sun, removing the ground from under the feet, and the cover from over the head, and the pain in his icy heart ceased. "Look at me, Lazarus!" commanded Augustus, staggering. Time ceased, and the beginning of things came perilously near to the end. The throne of Augustus, so recently erected, fell to pieces, and emptiness took the place of the throne and of Augustus. Rome fell silently into ruins. A new city rose in its place, and it too was erased by emptiness. Like phantom giants, cities, kingdoms, and countries swiftly fell and disappeared into emptiness, swallowed up in the black maw of the infinite. "Cease!" commanded the emperor. Already the accent of indifference was in his voice. His arms hung powerless, and his eagle eyes flashed and were dimmed again, struggling against overwhelming darkness. "You have killed me, Lazarus," he said drowsily. These words of despair saved him. He thought of the people, whose shield he was destined to be, and a sharp redeeming pang pierced his dull heart. He thought of them doomed to perish, and he was filled with anguish. First they seemed bright shadows in the gloom of the infinite. How terrible! Then they appeared as fragile vessels with life-agitated blood, and hearts that knew both sorrow and great joy. And he thought of them with tenderness. And so thinking and feeling, inclining the scales now to the side of life, now to the side of death, he slowly returned to life, to find in its suffering and joy a refuge from the gloom, emptiness, and fear of the infinite. "No, you did not kill me, Lazarus," said he firmly, "but I will kill you. Go." Evening came, and divine Augustus partook of food and drink with great joy, but there were moments when his raised arm would remain suspended in the air, and the light of his shining eager eyes was dimmed. It was as if an icy wave of horror washed against his feet. He was vanquished, but not killed, and coldly awaited his doom, like a black shadow. His nights were haunted by horror, but the bright days still brought him the joys, as well as the sorrows, of life. Next day, by order of the emperor, they burned out Lazarus's eyes with hot irons, and sent him home. Even Augustus dared not kill him. Lazarus returned to the desert, and the desert received him with the breath of the hissing wind and the ardour of the glowing sun. Again he sat on the stone with matted beard uplifted, and two black holes, where the eyes had once been, looked dull and horrible at the sky. In the distance the holy city surged and roared restlessly, but near him all was deserted and still. No one approached the place where Lazarus, miraculously raised from the dead, passed his last days, for his neighbours had long since abandoned their homes. His cursed knowledge, driven by the hot irons from his eyes deep into the brain, lay there in ambush. As if from ambush it might spring out upon men with 1,000 unseen eyes. No one dared to look at Lazarus. And in the evening, when the sun, swollen crimson and growing larger, bent its way toward the west, blind Lazarus slowly groped after it. He stumbled against stones and fell. Corpulent and feeble, he rose heavily and walked on. and against the red curtain of sunset his dark form and outstretched arms gave him the semblance of a cross. It happened once that he went and never returned. Thus ended the second life of Lazarus, who for 3 days had been in the mysterious thraldom of death, and then was miraculously raised from the dead. End of Lazarus, Eleazar, by Leonid Andreev. Recording by Algy Pug, Perth, Western Australia.
Chapter 21 of Best Russian Short Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Rachel Craig of Colorado Springs, Colorado, USA. Best Russian Short Stories. Edited and compiled by Thomas Seltzer. Chapter 21. The Revolutionist. By Mikhail Artsebayshev. 1. Gabriel Anderson, the teacher, walked to the edge of the school garden, where he paused, undecided what to do. Off in the distance, 2 miles away, the woods hung like bluish lace over a field of pure snow. It was a brilliant day. 100 tints glistened on the white ground and the iron bars of the garden railing. There was a lightness and transparency in the air that only the early days of spring possess. Gabriel Anderson turned his steps toward the fringe of blue lace for a tramp in the woods. "Another spring in my life," he said, breathing deep and peering up at the heavens through his spectacles. Anderson was rather given to sentimental poeticizing. He walked with his hands folded behind him, dangling his cane. He had gone but a few paces when he noticed a group of soldiers and horses on the road beyond the garden rail. Their drab uniforms stood out dully against the white of the snow, but their swords and horses' coats tossed back the light. Their bowed cavalry legs moved awkwardly on the snow. Anderson wondered what they were doing there. Suddenly the nature of their business flashed upon him. It was an ugly errand they were upon, an instinct rather that his reason told him. Something unusual and terrible was about to happen, and the same instinct told him he must conceal himself from the soldiers. He turned to the left quickly, dropped on his knees, and crawled on the soft, thawing, crackling snow to a low haystack, from behind which, by craning his neck, he could watch what the soldiers were doing. There were 12 of them, one a stocky young officer in a gray cloak, caught in prettily at the waist by a silver belt. His face was so red that even at that distance Anderson caught the odd whitish gleam of his light, protruding mustache and eyebrows against the vivid color of his skin. The broken tones of his raucous voice reached distinctly to where the teacher, listening intently, lay hidden. "I know what I'm about. I don't need anybody's advice," the officer cried. He clapped his arms akimbo and looked down at some one among the group of bustling soldiers. "I'll show you how to be a rebel, you damn skunk!" Anderson's heart beat fast. Good heavens, he thought, is it possible? His head grew chill as if struck by a cold wave. "Officer!" A quiet, restrained, yet distinct voice came from among the soldiers. "You have no right. It's for the court to decide. You aren't a judge. It's plain murder. Not—" "Silence!" thundered the officer, his voice choking with rage. "I'll give you a court. Ivanov, go ahead." He put the spurs to his horse and rode away. Gabriel Anderson mechanically observed how carefully the horse picked its way, placing its feet daintily as if for the steps of a minuet. Its ears were pricked to catch every sound. There was momentary bustle and excitement among the soldiers. Then they dispersed in different directions, leaving 3 persons in black behind, 2 tall men and 1 very short and frail. Anderson could see the hair of the short one's head. It was very light, and he saw his rosy ears sticking out on each side. Now he fully understood what was to happen. But it was a thing so out of the ordinary, so horrible, that he fancied he was dreaming. "It's so bright, so beautiful, the snow, the field, the woods, the sky. The breath of spring is upon everything, yet people are going to be killed. How can it be? Impossible!" So his thoughts ran in confusion. He had the sensation of a man suddenly gone insane, who finds he sees, hears, and feels what he is not accustomed to, and ought not to hear, see, and feel. The three men in black stood next to one another, hard by the railing. Two quite close together, the short one some distance away. "Officer!" one of them cried in a desperate voice. Anderson could not see which it was. "God sees us! Officer!" 8 soldiers dismounted quickly, their spurs and sabers catching awkwardly. Evidently they were in a hurry, as if doing a thief's job. Several seconds passed in silence, until the soldiers placed themselves in a row a few feet from the black figures and leveled their guns. In doing so, one soldier knocked his cap from his head. He picked it up and put it on again without brushing off the wet snow. The officer's mount still kept dancing on one spot, with his ears pricked, while the other horses, also with sharp ears erect to catch every sound, stood motionless, looking at the men in black, their long, wise heads inclined to one side. "Spare the boy, at least!" another voice suddenly pierced the air. "Why kill a child, damn you? What has the child done?" "Ivanov, do what I have told you to do!" thundered the officer, drowning the other voice. His face turned as scarlet as a piece of red flannel. There followed a scene savage and repulsive in its gruesomeness. The short figure in black, with the light hair and the rosy ears, uttered a wild shriek in a shrill child's tones, and reeled to one side. Instantly it was caught up by 2 or 3 soldiers, but the boy began to struggle, and 2 more soldiers ran up. "Ow! Ow! Ow! Ow!" the boy cried. "Let me go! Let me go! Ow! Ow!" His shrill voice cut the air like the yell of a stuck porkling not quite done to death. Suddenly he grew quiet. Someone must have stuck him. An unexpected oppressive silence ensued. The boy was being pushed forward. Then there came a deafening report. Anderson started back all in a tremble. He saw distinctly, yet vaguely as in a dream, the dropping of 2 dark bodies, the flash of pale sparks, and a light smoke rising in the clean, bright atmosphere. He saw the soldiers hastily mounting their horses without even glancing at the bodies. He saw them galloping along the muddy road, their armors clanking, their horses' hoofs clattering. He saw all this, himself now standing in the middle of the road, not knowing when and why he had jumped from behind the haystack. He was deathly pale. His face was covered with dank sweat. His body was a-quiver. A physical sadness smote and tortured him. He could not make out the nature of the feeling. It was akin to extreme sickness, though far more nauseating and terrible. After the soldiers had disappeared beyond the bend toward the woods, people came hurrying to the spot of the shooting, though till then not a soul had been in sight. The bodies lay at the roadside on the other side of the railing, where the snow was clean, brittle, and untrampled, and glistened cheerfully in the bright atmosphere. There were 3 dead bodies, 2 men and a boy. The boy lay with his long, soft neck stretched on the snow. The face of the man next to the boy was invisible. He had fallen face downward in a pool of blood. The third was a big man with a black beard and huge, muscular arms. He lay stretched out to the full length of his big body, his arms extended over a large area of blood-stained snow. The 3 men who had been shot lay black against the white snow, motionless. From afar no one could have told the terror that was in their immobility as they lay there at the edge of the narrow road crowded with people. That night Gabriel Anderson, in his little room in the schoolhouse, did not write poems as usual. He stood at the window and looked at the distant pale disk of the moon in the misty blue sky and thought. And his thoughts were confused, gloomy, and heavy, as if a cloud had descended upon his brain. Indistinctly outlined in the dull moonlight, he saw the dark railing, the trees, the empty garden. It seemed to him that he beheld them, the 3 men who had been shot, 2 grown up, 1 child. They were lying there now on the roadside, in the empty, silent field, looking at the far-off cold moon, with their dead white eyes, as he with his living eyes. The time will come some day, he thought, when the killing of people by others will be an utter impossibility. The time will come when even the soldiers and officers who killed these 3 men will realize what they have done, and will understand that what they killed them for is just as necessary, important, and dear to them, to the officers and soldiers, as to those whom they killed. Yes, he said aloud and solemnly, his eyes moistening, That time will come. They will understand. And the pale disk of the moon was blotted out by the moisture in his eyes. A large pity pierced his heart for the 3 victims whose eyes looked at the moon, sad and unseeing. A feeling of rage cut him as with a sharp knife, and took possession of him. But Gabriel Andersen quieted his heart, whispering softly, "They know not what they do." And this old and ready phrase gave him the strength to stifle his rage and indignation. 2. The day was as bright and white, but the spring was already advanced. The wet soil smelt of spring. Clear, cold water ran everywhere from under the loose thawing snow. The branches of the trees were springy and elastic. For miles and miles around, the country opened up in clear azure stretches. Yet the clearness and the joy of the spring day were not in the village. They were somewhere outside the village, where there were no people, in the fields, the woods, and the mountains. In the village the air was stifling, heavy, and terrible as in a nightmare. Gabriel Andersen stood in the road near a crowd of dark, sad, absent-minded people, and craned his neck to see the preparations for the flogging of 7 peasants. They stood in the thawing snow, and Gabriel Andersen could not persuade himself that they were people whom he had long known and understood. By that which was about to happen to them, the shameful, terrible, ineradicable thing that was about to happen to them, they were separated from all the rest of the world, and so were unable to feel what he, Gabriel Andersen, felt, just as he was unable to feel what they felt. Round them were the soldiers, confidently and beautifully mounted on high upon their large steeds, who tossed their wise heads and turned their dappled wooden faces slowly from side to side, looking contemptuously at him, Gabriel Andersen, who was soon to behold this horror, this disgrace, and would do nothing, would not dare to do anything. So it seemed to Gabriel Andersen, and a sense of cold, intolerable shame gripped him as between 2 clamps of ice through which he could see everything without being able to move, cry, or utter a groan. They took the first peasant. Gabriel Andersen saw his strange, imploring, hopeless look. His lips moved, but no sound was heard, and his eyes wandered. There was a bright gleam in them, as in the eyes of a madman. His mind, it was evident, was no longer able to comprehend what was happening. And so terrible was that face, at once full of reason and of madness, that Andersen felt relieved when they put him face down on the snow, and, instead of the fiery eyes, he saw his bare back glistening, a senseless, shameful, horrible sight. The large, red-faced soldier in a red cap pushed toward him, looked down at his body with seeming delight, and then cried in a clear voice, "Well, let her go, with God's blessing." Andersen seemed not to see the soldiers, the sky, the horses, or the crowd. He did not feel the cold, the terror, or the shame. He did not hear the swish of the knout in the air, or the savage howl of pain and despair. He only saw the bare back of a man's body, swelling up, and covered over evenly with white and purple stripes. Gradually the bare back lost the semblance of human flesh. The blood oozed and squirted, forming patches, drops and rivulets, which ran down on the white, thawing snow. Terror gripped the soul of Gabriel Andersen as he thought of the moment when the man would rise and face all the people who had seen this broad body out in the open and reduced to a bloody pulp. He closed his eyes. When he opened them, he saw 4 soldiers in uniform and red hats, forcing another man down on the snow, his back bared just as shamefully, terribly, and absurdly, a ludicrously tragic sight. Then came the 3rd, the 4th, and so on, to the end. And Gabriel Andersen stood on the wet, thawing snow, craning his neck, trembling and stuttering, though he did not say a word. Dank sweat poured from his body. A sense of shame permeated his whole being. It was a humiliating feeling, having to escape being noticed so that they should not catch him and lay him there on the snow and strip him bare, him, Gabriel Andersen. The soldiers pressed and crowded, the horses tossed their heads, the knout swished in the air, and the bare, shamed human flesh swelled up, tore, ran over with blood, and curled like a snake. Oaths, wild shrieks rained upon the village through the clean white air of that spring day. Andersen now saw 5 men's faces at the steps of the town hall, the faces of those men who had already undergone their shame. He quickly turned his eyes away. After seeing this a man must die, he thought. 3. There were 17 of them, 15 soldiers, a subaltern, and a young beardless officer. The officer lay in front of the fire, looking intently into the flames. The soldiers were tinkering with their firearms in the wagon. Their gray figures moved about quietly at the black thawing ground, and occasionally stumbled across the logs sticking out from the blazing fire. Gabriel Anderson, wearing an overcoat and carrying his cane behind his back, approached them. The subaltern, a stout fellow with a mustache, jumped up and turned from the fire and looked at him. "Who are you? What do you want?" he asked excitedly. From his tone it was evident that the soldiers feared everybody in that district, through which they were scattering death, destruction, and torture. "Officer," he said, "there is a man here I don't know." The officer looked at Anderson without speaking. "Officer," said Anderson in a thin, strained voice, "my name is Michelson. I am a businessman here, and I am going to the village on business. I was afraid I might be mistaken for someone else, you know." "Then what are you nosing about here for?" the officer said angrily and turned away. "A businessman," sneered a soldier. "He ought to be searched. This businessman ought, so as not to be knocking about at night. A good one in the jaw is what he needs." "He's a suspicious character, officer," said the subaltern. "Don't you think we'd better arrest him? What?" "Don't," answered the officer lazily. "I'm sick of them, damn 'em." Gabriel Anderson stood there without saying anything. His eyes flashed strangely in the dark by the firelight, and it was strange to see his short, substantial, clean, neat figure in the field at night among the soldiers, with his overcoat and cane and glasses glistening in the firelight. The soldiers left him and walked away. Gabriel Anderson remained standing for a while. Then he turned and left, rapidly disappearing into the darkness. The night was drawing to a close. The air turned chilly, and the tops of the bushes defined themselves more clearly in the dark. Gabriel Anderson went again to the military post, but this time he hid, crouching low as he made his way under the cover of the bushes. Behind him, people moved about quietly and carefully, bending the bushes, silent as shadows. Next to Gabriel, on his right, walked a tall man with a revolver in his hand. The figure of a soldier on the hill outlined itself strangely, unexpectedly, not where they had been looking for it. It was faintly illumined by the gleam of the dying fire. Gabriel Anderson recognized the soldier. It was the one who had proposed that he should be searched. Nothing stirred in Anderson's heart. His face was cold and motionless, as of a man who is asleep. Round the fire the soldiers lay stretched out sleeping, all except the subaltern, who sat with his head drooping over his knees. The tall, thin man on Anderson's right raised the revolver and pulled the trigger. A momentary, blinding flash, a deafening report. Anderson saw the guard lift his hands and then sit down on the ground, clasping his bosom. From all directions short, crackling sparks flashed up, which combined into one riveting roar. The subaltern jumped up and dropped straight into the fire. Gray soldiers' figures moved about in all directions, like apparitions, throwing up their hands and falling and writhing on the black earth. The young officer ran past Anderson, fluttering his hands like some strange, frightened bird. Anderson, as if he were thinking of something else, raised his cane. With all his strength he hit the officer on the head, each blow descending with a dull, ugly thud. The officer reeled in a circle, struck a bush, and sat down after the second blow, covering his head with both hands, as children sometimes do. Someone ran up and discharged a revolver, as if from Anderson's own hand. The officer sank together in a heap, and lunged with great force head foremost on the ground. His legs twitched for a while, then he curled up quietly. The shot ceased. Black men with white faces, ghostly gray in the dark, moved about the dead bodies of the soldiers, taking away their arms and ammunition. Anderson watched all this with a cold, attentive stare. When all was over, he went up, took hold of the burned subaltern's legs, and tried to remove the body from the fire, but it was too heavy for him, and he let it go. 4. Anderson sat motionless on the steps of the town hall and thought. He thought of how he, Gabriel Anderson, with his spectacles, cane, overcoat, and poems, had lied and betrayed 15 men. He thought it was terrible, yet there was neither pity, shame, nor regret in his heart. Were he to be set free, he knew that he, Gabriel Anderson, with the spectacles and poems, would go straight away and do it again. He tried to examine himself, to see what was going on inside his soul. But his thoughts were heavy and confused. For some reason it was more painful for him to think of the 3 men lying on the snow, looking at the pale disk of the far-off moon, with their dead, unseeing eyes, than of the murdered officer whom he had struck 2 dry, ugly blows on the head. Of his own death he did not think. It seemed to him that he had done with everything long, long ago. Something had died, had gone out and left him empty, and he must not think about it. And when they grabbed him by the shoulder and he rose, and they quickly led him through the garden where the cabbages raised their dry heads, he could not formulate a single thought. He was conducted to the road and placed at the railing with his back to one of the iron bars. He fixed his spectacles, put his hands behind him, and stood there with his neat, stocky body, his head slightly inclined to one side. At the last moment he looked in front of him and saw rifle barrels pointing at his head, chest, and stomach, and pale faces with trembling lips. He distinctly saw how one barrel leveled at his forehead suddenly dropped. Something strange and incomprehensible, as if no longer of this world, no longer earthly, passed through Anderson's mind. He straightened himself to the full height of his short body and threw back his head in simple pride. A strange, indistinct sense of cleanness, strength, and pride filled his soul, and everything, the sun and the sky and the people and the field and death, seemed to him insignificant, remote, and useless. The bullets hit him in the chest, in the left eye, in the stomach, went through his clean coat buttoned all the way up. His glasses shivered into bits. He uttered a shriek, circled round, and fell with his face against one of the iron bars, his one remaining eye open. He clawed the ground with his outstretched hands as if trying to support himself. The officer who had turned green rushed toward him, and senselessly thrust the revolver against his neck, and fired twice. Anderson stretched out on the ground. The soldiers left quickly, but Anderson remained pressed flat to the ground. The index finger of his left hand continued to quiver for about 10 seconds. End of The Revolutionist by Mikhail Artsebaishev. Recording by Rachel Craig. www.ttb.org. The Outrage, A True Story by Alexander Ivanovich Kuprin. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording by Rachel Craig of Colorado Springs, USA. The Outrage, A True Story. It was 5 o'clock on a July afternoon. The heat was terrible. The whole of the huge stone-built town breathed out heat like a glowing furnace. The glare of the white-walled house was insufferable. The asphalt pavements grew soft and burned the feet. The shadows of the acacias spread over the cobbled road, pitiful and weary. They too seemed hot. The sea, pale in the sunlight, lay heavy and immobile as one dead. Over the streets hung a white dust. In the foyer of one of the private theaters, a small committee of local barristers, who had undertaken to conduct the cases of those who had suffered in the last pogrom against the Jews, was reaching the end of its daily task. There were 19 of them, all juniors, young, progressive, and conscientious men. This sitting was without formality, and white suits of duck, flannel, and alpaca were in the majority. They sat anywhere, at little marble tables, and the chairman stood in front of the empty counter where chocolates were sold in the winter. The barristers were quite exhausted by the heat which poured in through the windows, with the dazzling sunlight and the noise of the streets. The proceedings went lazily and with a certain irritation. A tall young man with a fair mustache and thin hair was in the chair. He was dreaming voluptuously how he would be off in an instant on his new-bought bicycle to the bungalow. He would undress quickly, and without waiting to cool, still bathed in sweat, would fling himself into the clear, cold, sweet-smelling sea. His whole body was enervated and tense, thrilled by the thought. Impatiently moving the papers before him, he spoke in a drowsy voice. "So, Joseph Moritzovich will conduct the cases of Rubinschik. Perhaps there is still mention to be made on the order of the day?" His youngest colleague, a short, stout Karaite, very black and lively, said in a whisper so that everyone could hear, "On the order of the day, the best thing would be iced kvass." The chairman gave him a stern side glance, but could not restrain a smile. He sighed and put both hands on the table to raise himself and declare the meeting closed, when the doorkeeper, who stood at the entrance to the theatre, suddenly moved forward and said, "There are 7 people outside, sir. They want to come in." The chairman looked impatiently round the company. "What's to be done, gentlemen?" Voices were heard. "Next time, basta! Let 'em put it in writing. If they'll get it over with, decide it at once. Let 'em go to the devil. Phew! It's like boiling pitch." "Let them in." The chairman gave them a sign with his head, annoyed. "Then bring me a vichy, please, but it must be cold." The porter opened the door and called down the corridor, "Come in, they say you may." Then 7 of the most surprising and unexpected individuals filed into the foyer. First appeared a full-grown, competent man in a smart suit of the color of dry sea sand and a magnificent pink shirt with white stripes and a crimson rose in his buttonhole. From the front, his head looked like an upright bean. From the side, like a horizontal bean. His face was adorned with a strong, bushy, martial mustache. He wore dark blue pince nez on his nose, and in his hands straw-covered gloves. In his left hand he held a black walking stick with a silver mount, in his right a light blue handkerchief. The other 6 produced a strange, chaotic, incongruous impression, exactly as though they had all hastily pulled not merely their clothes, but their hands, feet, and heads as well. There was a man with the splendid profile of a Roman senator, dressed in rags and tatters. Another wore an elegant dressed waistcoat, from the deep opening of which a dirty little Russian shirt leapt to the eye. Here were the unbalanced faces of the criminal type, but looking with a confidence that nothing could shake. All these men, in spite of their apparent youth, evidently possessed a large experience of life, an easy manner, a bold approach, and some hidden, suspicious cunning. The gentleman in the sandy suit bowed just his head, neatly and easily, and said with a half-question in his voice, "Mr. Chairman?" "Yes, I am the chairman. What is your business?" "We, all who you see before you," the gentleman began in a quiet voice, and turned around to indicate his companions. "We come as delegates from the United Rostov, Kharkov, and Odessa Nikolaev Association of Thieves." The barristers began to shift in their seats. The chairman flung himself back and opened his eyes wide. "Association of what?" he said, perplexed. "The Association of Thieves," the gentleman in the sandy suit coolly repeated. "As for myself, my comrades did me the signal glory of electing me the spokesperson of this deputation." "Very pleased," the chairman said uncertainly. "Thank you. All 7 of us are ordinary thieves, naturally of different departments. The association has authorized us to put before your esteemed committee," the gentleman again made an elegant bow, "our respectful demand for assistance." "I don't quite understand, quite frankly, what is the connection—" The chairman waved his hands helplessly. "However, please go on." "The matter about which we have the courage and the honor to apply to you, gentlemen, is very clear, very simple, and very brief. It will take only 6 or 7 minutes. I consider it my duty to warn you of this beforehand, in view of the late hour and the 115 degrees that Fahrenheit marks in the shade." The orator expectorated slightly and glanced at his superb gold watch. "You see, in the reports that have lately appeared in the local papers of the melancholy and terrible days of the last pogrom, there have very often been indications that among the instigators of the pogrom, who were paid and organized by the police, the dregs of society consisting of drunkards, tramps, souteniers, and hooligans from the slums, thieves were also to be found. At first we were silent, but finally finally we considered ourselves under the necessity of protesting against such an unjust and serious accusation, before the face of the whole of intellectual society. I know well that in the eye of the law we are offenders and enemies of society. But imagine only for a moment, gentlemen, the situation of this enemy of society when he is accused wholesale of an offence which he not only never committed, but which he is ready to resist with the whole strength of his soul. It goes without saying that he will feel the outrage of such an injustice more keenly than a normal, average, fortunate citizen. Now, we declare that the accusation brought against us is utterly devoid of all basis, not merely of fact, but even of logic. I intend to prove this in a few words, if the honourable committee will kindly listen. Proceed, said the chairman. Please do, please, was heard from the barristers, now animated. I offer you my sincere thanks in the name of all my comrades. Believe me, you will never repent your attention to our representatives of our, well, let us say slippery but nonetheless difficult profession. So we begin, as Giraldoni sings in the prologue of Pagliacci. But first I would ask your permission, Mr. Chairman, to quench my thirst a little. Porter, bring me a lemonade and a glass of English bitter. There's a good fellow. Gentlemen, I will not speak of the moral aspect of our profession, nor of its social importance. Doubtless you know better than I the striking and brilliant paradox of Proudhon. La proprie c'est la vol. A paradox, if you like, but one that has never yet been refuted by the sermons of cowardly bourgeois or fat priests. For instance, a father accumulates $1 million by energetic and clever exploitation and leaves it to his son, a rickety, lazy, ignorant, degenerate idiot, a brainless maggot, a true parasite. Potentially 1,000,000 rubles is 1,000,000 working days, the absolutely irrational right to labor, sweat, and blood of a terrible number of men. Why? What is the ground of reason? Utterly unknown. Then why not agree with the proposition, gentlemen, that our profession is to some extent, as it were, a correction of the excessive accumulation of values in the hands of individuals, and serves as a protest against all the hardships, abominations, arbitrariness, violence, and negligence of the human personality, against all the monstrosities created by the bourgeois, capitalistic organization of modern society. Sooner or later, this order of things will assuredly be overturned by the social revolution. Property will pass away in the limbo of melancholy memories, and with it, alas, we will disappear from the face of the earth. We, les braves chevaliers d'industrie. The orator paused to take the tray from the hands of the porter, and placed it near his hands on the table. Excuse me, gentlemen. Here, my good man, take this. And by the way, when you go, shut the door and close it behind you. Very good, your excellency, the porter bawled in jest. The orator drank off half his glass and continued. However, let us leave aside the philosophical, social, and economic aspects of the question. I do not wish to fatigue your attention. I must nevertheless point out that our profession very closely approaches the idea of that which is called art. Into it enter all the elements which go to form art: vocation, inspiration, fantasy, inventiveness, ambition, and a long and arduous apprenticeship to the science. From it is absent virtue alone, concerning which the great Karamzin wrote with such stupendous and fiery fascination. Gentlemen, nothing is further from my intention than to trifle with you and waste your precious time with idle paradoxes, but I cannot avoid expounding my idea briefly. To an outsider's ear it sounds absurdly wild and ridiculous to speak of the vocation of a thief. However, I venture to assure you that this vocation is a reality. There are men who possess a peculiarly strong visual memory, sharpness and accuracy of eye, presence of mind, dexterity of hand, and above all a subtle sense of touch, who are, as it were, born into God's world for the sole and special purpose of becoming distinguished card sharpers. The pickpocketer's profession demands extraordinary nimbleness and agility, a terrific certainty of movement, not to mention a ready wit, a talent for observation, and a strained attention. Some have a positive vocation for breaking open safes. From their tenderest childhood they are attracted by the mysteries of every kind of complicated mechanism, bicycles, sewing machines, clockwork toys, and watches. Finally, gentlemen, there are people with a hereditary animus against private property. You may call this phenomenon degeneracy, but I tell you that you cannot entice a true thief, and thief by vocation, into the prose of honest vegetation by any gingerbread reward, or by the offer of a secure position, or by the gift of money, or by a woman's love. Because there is here a permanent beauty of risk, a fascinating abyss of danger, the delightful sinking of the heart, the impetuous pulsation of life, the ecstasy. You are armed with the protection of the law, by locks, revolvers, telephones, police, and soldiery. But we only by our dexterity, cunning, and fearlessness. We are the foxes. And society is a chicken run, guarded by dogs. Are you aware that the most artistic and gifted natures in our villages become horse thieves and poachers? What would you have? Life is so meagre, so insipid, so intolerably dull to eager and high-spirited souls. I pass on to inspiration. Gentlemen, doubtless you have read of the thefts that were supernatural in design and execution. In the headlines of the newspapers they are called an amazing robbery, or an ingenious swindle, or again, a clever ruse of the gangsters. In such cases our bourgeois paterfamilias waves his hands and exclaims, "What a terrible thing! If only their abilities were turned to good, their inventiveness, their amazing knowledge of human psychology, their self-possession, their fearlessness, their incomparable histrionic powers. What extraordinary benefits they would bring to the country." But it is well known that the bourgeois paterfamilias was specially devised by heaven to utter commonplaces and trivialities. I myself sometimes, we thieves are a sentimental people, I confess, I myself sometimes admire a beautiful sunset in Alexandra Park or by the seashore, and I am always certain beforehand that someone near me will say with infallible aplomb, "Look at it. If it were put into a picture, no one would ever believe it." I turn round, and naturally I see a self-satisfied, full-fed paterfamilias who delights in repeating someone else's silly statement as though it were his own. As for our dear country, the bourgeois paterfamilias looks upon it as though it were a roast turkey. If you've managed to cut the best part of the bird for yourself, eat it quietly in a comfortable corner and praise God. But he's not really the important person. I was led away by my detestation of vulgarity, and I apologize for the digression. The real point is that genius and inspiration, even when they are not devoted to the service of the Orthodox Church, remain rare and beautiful things. Progress is a law, and theft too has its creation. Finally, our profession is by no means as easy and pleasant as it seems at first glance. It demands long experience, constant practice, slow and painful apprenticeship. It comprises in itself hundreds of supple, skillful processes that the cleverest juggler cannot compass. That I may not give you only empty words, gentlemen, I will perform a few experiments before you now. I ask you to have every confidence in the demonstrators. We are all at present in the enjoyment of legal freedom, and though we are all usually watched, and every one of us is known by face, and our photographs adorn the albums of all detective departments, for the time being we are not under the necessity of hiding ourselves from anybody. If any one of you should recognize any of us in the future under different circumstances, we ask you earnestly, always, to act in accordance with your professional duties and your obligations as citizens. In grateful return for your kind attention, we have decided to declare your property inviolable, and to invest it with thieves' taboo. However, I proceed to business. The orator turned round and gave an order. "Sesoi the Great, will you come this way?" An enormous fellow with a stoop, whose hands reached to his knees, without a forehead or neck, like a big, fair Hercules, came forward. He grinned stupidly and rubbed his left eyebrow in his confusion. "Can't do nothing here," he said hoarsely. The gentleman in the sandy suit spoke for him, turning to the committee. "Gentlemen, before you stands a respected member of our association. His specialty is breaking open safes, iron strong-boxes, and other receptacles for monetary tokens. In his night work he sometimes avails himself of the electric current of the lightning installation for fusing metals. Unfortunately, he has nothing on which he can demonstrate the best items of his repertoire. He will open the most elaborate lock irreproachably. By the way, this door here, it's locked, is it not? Everyone turned to look at the door on which a printed notice hung. Stage door, strictly private. Yes, the door's locked, evidently, the chairman agreed. Admirable. Sesoi the Great, will you be so kind? "'Tain't nothing at all," said the giant leisurely. He went close to the door, shook it cautiously with his hand, took out of his pocket a small bright instrument, bent down to the keyhole, made some almost imperceptible movements with the tool, and suddenly straightened and flung the door wide in silence. The chairman had his watch in his hands. The whole affair took only 10 seconds. "Thank you, Sesoi the Great," said the gentleman in the sandy suit politely. "You may go back to your seat." But the chairman interrupted in some alarm. "Excuse me, this is all very interesting and instructive, but is it included in your esteemed colleague's profession to be able to lock the door again?" "Ah, mille pardons," the gentleman bowed hurriedly. "It slipped my mind. Sesoi the Great, would you oblige?" The door was locked with the same adroitness and the same silence. The esteemed colleague waddled back to his friends, grinning. "Now I will have the honour to show you the skill of one of our comrades who is in the line of picking pockets in theatres and railway stations," continued the orator. "He is still very young, but you may to some extent judge from the delicacy of his present work of the heights he will attain by diligence. Yasha!" A swarthy youth in a blue silk blouse and long lace boots, like a gypsy, came forward with a swagger, fingering the tassels of his belt, and merrily screwing up his big, impudent black eyes with yellow whites. "Gentlemen," said the gentleman in the sandy suit persuasively, "I must ask if one of you would be kind enough to submit yourself to a little experiment. I assure you this will be an exhibition only, just a game." He looked round over the seated company. The short, plump Karaite, black as a beetle, came forward from his table. "At your service," he said amusedly. "Yasha!" The orator signed his head. Yasha came close to the solicitor. On his left arm, which was bent, hung a bright-coloured, figured scarf. "Suppose you're in church or at the bar in one of the halls, or watching a circus," he began in a sugary, fluent voice. "I see straight off. There's the toff. Excuse me, sir. Suppose you're the toff. There's no offence. Just means a rich gent, decent enough, but don't know his way about. First, what's he likely to have about him? All sorts. Most likely a ticker and a chain. Whereabouts does he keep 'em? Somewhere in his top vest pocket. Here. Others have 'em in the bottom pocket. Just here. Purse? Most always in the trousers, except when a greenie keeps it in his jacket. Cigar case. Have a look at it first. What is it? Gold, silver, with a monogram. Leather. What decent man 'ud soil his hands? Cigar case. 7 pockets. Here, 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 up there, here, and here again. That's right, ain't it? That's how you go to work." As he spoke, the young man smiled. His eyes shone straight into the barrister's. With a quick, dexterous movement of his right hand, he pointed to various portions of his clothes. "Then again, you might see a pin here in the tie. However, we do not appropriate. Such gents nowadays, they hardly ever wear real stone. Then it comes up to him. I begin straight off to talk to him like a gent. 'Sir, would you be so kind as to give me a light from your cigarette?' or something of the sort. At any rate, I enter into conversation. What's next? I look him straight in the peepers, just like this. Only 2 of me fingers are at it. Just this and this." Yasha lifted 2 fingers of his right hand on a level with the solicitor's face, the forefinger and the middle finger, and moved them about. "Do you see? With these 2 fingers I run over the whole pianner. Nothing's wonderful in it. 1, 2, 3, ready. Any man who wasn't stupid could learn easily. That's all it is. Most ordinary business. I thank you." The pickpocket swung on his heel as if to return to his seat. Yasha, the gentleman in the sandy suit said with meaning weight. Yasha, he repeated sternly. Yasha stopped. His back was turned to the barrister, but he evidently gave his representative an imploring look, because the latter frowned and shook his head. Yasha, he said for the third time in a threatening tone. Huh, the thief grunted in vexation and turned to face the solicitor. Where's your little watch, sir? He said in a piping voice. Oh, the Karaite brought himself up sharply. You see, now you say oh, Yasha continued reproachfully. All the while you were just admiring me right hand, I was operating your watch with me left, just with these two little fingers, under the scarf. That's why we carry a scarf, since your chain's not worth anything, a present from some mamselle, and the watch is a gold one. I've left you the chain as a keepsake. Take it, he added with a sigh, holding out the watch. But that is clever, the barrister said in confusion. I didn't notice it at all. That's our business, Yasha said with pride. He swaggered back to his comrades. Meantime, the orator took a drink from his glass and continued. Now, gentlemen, our next collaborator will give you an exhibition of some ordinary card tricks, which are worked at fairs, on steamboats, and railways. With 3 cards, for instance, an ace, a queen, and a 6, he can quite easily... But perhaps you are tired of these demonstrations, gentlemen. Not at all. It's extremely interesting, the chairman answered affably. I should like to ask one question. That is, if it's not too indiscreet. What is your own specialty? Mine? No. How could it be an indiscretion? I work the big diamond shops, and my other business is banks, answered the orator with a modest smile. Don't think this occupation is easier than others. Enough that I know 4 European languages, German, French, English, and Italian, not to mention Polish, Ukrainian, and Yiddish. But shall I show you some more experiments, Mr. Chairman? The chairman looked at his watch. Unfortunately, the time is too short, he said. Wouldn't it be better to pass on to the substance of your business? Besides, the experiments we have just seen have amply convinced us of the talent of your esteemed associates. Am I not right, Isaac Abramovich? Yes, absolutely, the Karaite barrister readily confirmed. Admirable, the gentleman in the sandy suit kindly agreed. My dear Count, he turned to a blond, curly-haired man with a face like a billiard-maker on a holiday. Put your instruments away. They will not be wanted. I have only a few words more to say, gentlemen. Now that you have convinced yourselves that our art, although it does not enjoy the patronage of high-placed individuals, is nevertheless an art, and you have probably come to my opinion that this art is one which demands many personal qualities besides constant labor, danger, and unpleasant misunderstandings, you will also, I hope, believe that it is possible to become attached to its practice and to love and esteem it, however strange that may appear at first sight. Picture to yourselves that a famous poet of talent, one whose tales and poems adorn the pages of our best magazines, is suddenly offered the chance of writing verses at a penny a line, signed into the bargain as an advertisement for cigarettes Jasmine. Or that a slander was spread about one of you, the distinguished barristers, accusing you of making a business of concocting evidence for divorce cases, or of writing petitions from the cabmen to the government in public houses. Certainly, your relatives, friends, and acquaintances wouldn't believe it, but the rumor has already done its poisonous work, and you have to live through minutes of torture. Now picture to yourselves that such a disgraceful and vexatious slander, started by God knows whom, begins to threaten not only your good name and your quiet digestion, but your freedom, your health, and even your life. This is the position of us thieves, now being slandered by the newspapers. I must explain. There is in existence a class of scum, passez-moi le mot, whom we call their mother's darlings. With these we are unfortunately confused. They have neither shame nor conscience. A dissipated riffraff, mother's useless darlings, idle, clumsy drones, shop assistants who commit unskilful thefts. He thinks nothing of living on his mistress, a prostitute, like the male mackerel, who always swims after the female and lives on her excrements. He is capable of robbing a child with violence in a dark alley in order to get a penny. He will kill a man in his sleep and torture an old woman. These men are the pests of our profession. For them, the beauties and the traditions of the art have no existence. They watch us real, talented thieves, like a pack of jackals after a lion. Suppose I've managed to bring off an important job. We won't mention the fact that I have to leave 2/3 of what I get to the receivers who sell the goods and discount the notes, or the customary subsidies to our incorruptible police. I still have to share out something to each of these parasites who have got wind of my job by accident, hearsay, or casual glance. So we call them moitians, which means half, a corruption of moitié, original etymology. I pay him only because he knows and may inform against me, and it mostly happens that even when he's got his share he runs off to the police in order to get another $1. We honest thieves, yes, you may laugh, gentlemen, but I repeat it, we honest thieves detest these reptiles. We have another name for them, a stigma of ignominy, but I dare not utter it here in the respect and place of my audience. Oh yes, they would gladly accept an invitation to a pogrom. The thought that we may be confused with them is 100 times more insulting to us even than the accusation of taking part in the pogrom. Gentlemen, while I have been speaking, I have often noticed smiles on your faces. I understand you. Our presence here, our application for your assistance, and above all, the unexpectedness of such a phenomenon as a systemic organization of thieves, with delegates who are thieves, and a leader of the deputation, also a thief by profession. It is all so original that it must inevitably arouse a smile. But now I will speak from the depth of my heart. Let us be rid of our outward wrappings, gentlemen. Let us speak as men to men. Almost all of us are educated, and all love books. We don't only read the adventures of Raconbele, as the realistic writers say of us. Do you think our hearts did not bleed and our cheeks did not burn from shame, as though we had been slapped in the face, all the time that this unfortunate, disgraceful, accursed, cowardly war lasted? Do you really think that our souls did not flame with anger when our country is lashed with Cossack whips and trodden underfoot, shot and spit at by mad, exasperated men? Will you not believe that we thieves meet every step towards the liberation to come with a thrill of ecstasy? We understand, every one of us, perhaps only a little less than you, barristers, gentlemen, the real sense of the pogroms. Every time that some dastardly event or some ignominious failure has occurred, after executing a martyr in a dark corner of a fortress, or after deceiving public confidence, someone who is hidden and unapproachable gets frightened of the people's anger and diverts its vicious element upon the heads of the innocent Jews. Whose diabolical mind invents these pogroms, these titanic bloodlettings, these cannibal amusements for the dark, bestial souls? We all see with certain clearness that the last convulsions of bureaucracy are at hand. Forgive me if I present it imaginatively. There was a people that had a chief temple, wherein dwelt a bloodthirsty deity, behind a curtain guarded by priests. Once fearless hands tore the curtains away. Then all the people saw, instead of a god, a huge, shaggy, voracious spider, like a loathsome cuttlefish. They beat it and shot at it. It is dismembered already, but still, in the frenzy of its final agony, it stretches over all the ancient temple its disgusting, clawing tentacles. And the priests themselves, under sentence of death, push into the monster's grasp all whom they can seize in their terrified, trembling fingers. Forgive me, what I have said is probably wild and incoherent, but I am somewhat agitated. Forgive me, I continue. We thieves by profession know better than anyone else how these pogroms were organized. We wander everywhere, into public houses, markets, tea shops, doss houses, public places, the harbor. We can swear before God and man and posterity that we have seen how the police organized the massacres, without shame and almost without concealment. We know them all by face, in uniform or disguise. They invited many of us to take part, but there was none so vile among us as to give even the outward consent that fear might have extorted.
You know, of course, how the various strata of Russian society have towards the police. It is not even respected by those who avail themselves of its dark services. But we despise and hate it 10 times more, not because many of us have been tortured in the detective departments, which are just chambers of horror, beaten almost to death, beaten with whips of oxhide and of rubber in order to extort a confession or to make us betray a comrade. Yes, we hate them for that too. But we thieves, all of us who have been in prison, have a mad passion for freedom. Therefore, we despise our gaolers with all the hatred that a human heart can feel. I will speak for myself. I have been tortured 3 times by police detectives till I was half dead. My lungs and liver have been shattered. In the mornings I spit blood until I can breathe no more. But if I were told that I will be spared a 4th flogging only by shaking hands with the chief of the detective police, I would refuse to do it. And then the newspapers say that we took from the hands Judas's money, dripping with human blood. No, gentlemen, it is a slander which stabs our very souls and inflicts insufferable pain. Not money, nor threats, nor promises will suffice to make us mercenary murderers of our brethren, nor accomplices with them. Never, no, no, his comrades standing behind him began to murmur. I will say more, the thief continued. Many of us protected the victims during this pogrom. Our friend, called Sesoi the Great, you have just seen him, gentlemen, was then lodging with a Jewish bread-maker on the Moldavanka. With a poker in his hands, he defended the landlord from the great horde of assassins. It is true, Sesoi the Great is a man of enormous physical strength, and this is well known to many of the inhabitants of the Moldavanka. But you must agree, gentlemen, that in these moments Sesoi the Great looked straight into the face of death. Our comrade Martin the Miner, this gentleman here, the orator pointed to a pale bearded man with beautiful eyes who was holding himself in the background, saved an old Jewess whom he had never seen before, who was being pursued by a crowd of these canaille. They broke his head with a crowbar for his pains, smashed his arm in 2 places and splintered a rib. He is only just out of the hospital. That is the way our most ardent and determined members acted. The others trembled for anger and wept for their own impotence. None of us will forget the horrors of these bloody days and bloody nights, lit up by the glares of fires, those sobbing women, those little children's bodies torn to pieces and left lying in the streets. But for all that, not one of us thinks the police and the mob are the real origin of the evil. These teeny, stupid, loathsome vermin are only a senseless fist that is governed by a vile, calculating mind, moved by a diabolical will. Yes, gentlemen, the orator continued, we thieves have nevertheless merited your legal contempt. But when you, noble gentlemen, need the help of clever, brave, obedient men at the barricades, men who will be ready to meet death with a song and a jest on their lips for the most glorious word in the world, freedom, will you cast us off then and order us away because of an inveterate revulsion? Damn it all, the first victim in the French Revolution was a prostitute. She jumped up on the barricade, with her skirt caught elegantly up in her hand, and called out, "Which of you soldiers will dare shoot a woman?" "Yes, by God," the orator exclaimed aloud and brought down his fist to the marble tabletop. "They killed her, but her action was magnificent, and the beauty of her words immortal. If you should drive us away on the great day, we will turn to you and say, 'You spotless cherubim, if human thoughts had the power to wound, kill, and rob man of honor and property, then which of you innocent doves would not deserve the knout and imprisonment for life? Then we will go away from you and build our own gay, sporting, desperate thieves' barricade, and will die with such united songs on our lips that you will envy us, you who are whiter than snow.' But I have been more than once carried away. Forgive me. I am at the end. You now see, gentlemen, what feelings the newspaper slanders have excited in us. Believe in our sincerity and do what you can to remove the filthy stain which has so unjustly been cast upon us. I have finished." He went away from the table and joined his comrades. The barristers were whispering in an undertone, very much as the magistrate of the bench at sessions. Then the chairman rose. We trust you absolutely, and we will make every effort to clear your association of this most grievous charge. At the same time, my colleagues have authorized me, gentlemen, to convey to you their deep respect for your passionate feelings as citizens. And for my own part, I ask the leader of the deputation for permission to shake him by the hand. The two men, both tall and serious, held each other's hands in a strong, masculine grip. The barristers were leaving the theater, but four of them hung back a little beside the clothes rack in the hall. Isaac Abramovich could not find his new, smart gray hat anywhere. In its place on the wooden peg hung a cloth cap, jauntily flattened in on either side. "Yasha!" The stern voice of the orator was suddenly heard from the other side of the door. "Yasha, it's the last time I'll speak to you, curse you! Do you hear?" The heavy door opened wide. The gentleman in the sandy suit entered. In his hands he held Isaac Abramovich's hat. On his face was a well-bred smile. "Gentlemen, for heaven's sake forgive us. An odd little misunderstanding. One of our comrades exchanged his hat by accident. Oh, it is yours. 1,000 pardons. Doorkeeper, why don't you keep an eye on things, my good fellow, eh? Just give me that cap there. Once more, I ask you to forgive me, gentlemen." With a pleasant bow and the same well-bred smile, he made his way quickly into the street. End of The Outrage, a True Story, by Alexander Ivanovich Kuprin. Read by Rachel Craig of Colorado Springs, USA.